Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your listeners, we all have years that stand out in our lives above other years. For some it might be a traumatic event when something devastating happened to us that affected us emotionally, physically, even financially. We may have lost a loved one tragically in a fortuitous event like a car accident or after a long insufferable illness where we were not left unblemished by its harrowing effects on our lives, or the grievous sense of loss their death so clearly inflicted upon us. We may personally have faced the dark night of the soul in our own lives, when we were forced to confront our greatest fears, whatever they may be. It could be a year when something wonderful happened to us. A baby was born, perhaps, after a longing was finally fulfilled. Or perhaps we went abroad and had an unforgettable holiday that made every other holiday we had previously enjoyed look insipid by comparison. It'll always be those indelible events that may highlight certain years of our lives above others for us, as having impacted us the most, not necessarily in a good way. This is why some years sail past us so smoothly, like a serene boat on the ocean, without a dark thundercloud in sight, and with perfect weather conditions that barely even graze the sails, provoking no complications to arise or challenges to be overcome. Let's just say those are the ambiguous, non-distinct years that may fade with time, like a pair of old jeans that have been through the washing cycle too many times, and are not so easily remembered. You may look back on those seamless years and say, "What did I do in 1991? And you probably won't remember very much. That was what it was like for me regarding many years of my life, when nothing really stands out to grab my attention. Ostensibly, if the year was dreadful, I'd lightly bury it away, as so much of us do, and try to forget that it ever happened. But that is easier said than done, as most of us well know. I speak from experience. In truth, we will never forget the most awful things that happened in our lives. Let's just say anything dramatic that rudely bludgeons its way into our lives like a fortuitous wrecking ball, regretfully stays with us indefinitely, even in our bodies on a cellular level, where the memory is recorded for all time's sake, whether we know it or not. When my brother Stephen was only 10 years old, for example, he played with 2 older boys on our farm, and together they ingeniously made a petrol bomb with disastrous consequences where all 3 boys very luckily escaped with their lives. My brother fared the worst, which thankfully wasn't too badly. I hasten to say the indelible scars of that incident are left on the underside of his right arm. Over the years, people tirelessly ask him, "Where did you get that scar from?" He has to tell them about a moment of complete stupidity he would rarely rather forget all about, but even his own skin has failed him, for it has seared the memory on its surface like a sailor's tattoo. that he is not allowed to ever forget what happened on that inauspicious day when he got carried away with an outrageous idea that went badly wrong. For me, the most idiosyncratic and dreadful year of my entire life was in 1984, when I was only a 12-year-old girl at the time. All these years later, it cruelly reminds me of one of the most traumatic events of my entire life, where I was forced to face my darkest fears. It was also in the years 1992, along with 1994, that I was to learn there are mysteries in our world we may never fully comprehend or ever be able to make sense of. But before I tell you the extraordinary details of both stories, let me paint you a picture of my life in the 1980s. I was raised in a rustic-looking stone and wood farmhouse in the rolling hills of the viridescent Kentucky countryside, and I considered myself to be remarkably privileged to live in this prepossessing, picturesque part of the world. I grew up under the spirited, boyish example of my brother Stephen, who was 2 years older than myself, who made me forget I was a girl. I guess you could say I wasn't exposed to many feminine influences in my young life, so I didn't even know how to behave like a girl. Well, not really. Even our 2 rust-coloured Rhodesian Ridgebacks, Junior and Max, and our 1-legged marmalade cat, Golly, were all boys. Suffice to say, my mother was not a feminine role model in my life. She liked to rough it quite a lot. She never wore pretty dresses, or ever looked elegant a day in her life. I doubt she ever owned a dress. I think she had no desire to be a girly girl, and had been a perennial tomboy all her life, which I was fast becoming myself, not through any wilful choice of my own, but by the persuasively dominant influences of an all-masculine household, where estrogen was in short supply. My mother wore ripped jeans every day of her life, long before they ever came into fashion, heavy boots and men's plaid shirts. She never bothered about her blonde hair, that hung around her face limply in an unflattering messy curtain, that she would cack-handedly trim once in a while herself. I doubt she ever visited a hair salon in her entire life. And as for her nails, they were kept sensibly short, and at the end of the day, when she scrubbed them clean, they were filled with the honest dirt of a day spent labouring on our farm. My mother loved to work all day in the fields with my father, like the women in China do daily, as they dutifully attend to their rice paddies. Her heavily bronzed skin was old before its time, from being overexposed to the sun, and from never bothering to wear block-out. Her weathered leathery hands were tough and calloused, but I loved her hands, because they lovingly tucked me into bed every night, reading me a bedtime story, and devotedly prepared our meals every day. My mother was a superb cook, efficiently preparing us hearty fare, delicious pot roasts with vegetables, and sumptuous steamed puddings. My mother's mother had grown up in Ireland, so her Irish recipes, namely potato dishes and sticky sweet steamed puddings, were an intricate part of our daily lives. My father was a man of very few words. He never told us he loved us, as that was not his way, but we knew he unquestionably did, by his generous actions, as he would have done anything for us. Let's just say he was an awesome provider, ensuring that the family wanted for nothing. Never once in my life did I ever hear my father grumble or complain about anything, or raise his voice to us. If my father was remotely angry, his face would go decidedly pale, his lips would tremble, and he would very politely say, "I'm a bit disappointed," ostensibly if me or my brother had misbehaved. After my father had politely expressed his indignation, that would be the end of the matter. My father never held resentment or grudges. All that would be alien to him. The subject of his discord was never brought up again, or rubbed in our face. It had been long since forgotten. Even when my brother made that petrol bomb, my father simply said, "Don't do that again, son." And that was that. His words, although few, were very powerful in our lives. People called my father Jack, although his real name was Jackson. He was a man's man, built like an ox, with a powerful rock-hard body that he gleaned from a great deal of hard work managing the farm. I think if he was to see people working out in a gym today, he would consider that wasted energy that could have been expended far more usefully doing something productive, like chopping firewood or digging up a field where you can acquire the same physical results. I think the seeds of my story really began to take root 2 years before 1984, when I was only 10 years old. That was when my mother's beloved older sister Veronica came to stay with us for a week on the farm. She had told my mother that if my mother was not going to visit her in Boston, then she'd come to stay with us in Kentucky. I think she more or less invited herself to stay at our farm. "We can't be strangers, sis. Not any longer," she exclaimed. "If I don't visit you, it'll be years before I see you again. And I simply must meet my niece and nephew. It's ridiculous we haven't got together for so long. You are all the family I've got, and I've missed you so much." Me and my brother were terribly excited about meeting our Aunt Veronica, but we were also desperately shy, lacking in refined social graces, as our interaction with adults was few and far between. We were not entirely comfortable around strangers. On the day my aunt was due to visit our home, me and my brother hid in the old oak tree that overlooked the front door of our farmhouse and our extensive open carport, where my father parked his farming machinery and his trucks. I have no idea how long me and my brother hid in that tree, waiting in earnest with our binoculars at the ready for our aunt to arrive. It was common for us to climb trees, to run across the countryside in our bare feet, to ride our mountain bicycles, and even our horses bareback. I knew no different way of life. If you had seen me back then, you would have likely mistaken me for a boy, and a wild one at that. It would have only been my long blonde hair that would have assured you that I was not. "When is Aunt Veronica coming?" I whispered to my brother. "She's taking so long." I felt frustrated, hanging around in the tree branches indefinitely, as patience was not one of my virtues, whereas my brother, he could have sat up on the tree all day, and waited and waited. He had the self-discipline of a yogi. "Be patient, sis," whispered Stephen. "She'll be here soon, I'm sure." Soon we heard a truck's engine purring from the distance, and the sound got closer and closer. We heard tires crunching pebbles, and then we saw it. The smartest black car I've ever seen. For a moment the car remained stoically still in our driveway, as if the occupant was just taking stock of things. I held my breath, my heart pounding excitedly in my chest with an anxious trepidation. I wondered what my aunt would look like. I didn't expect her to be much different to my mother, but I nearly fell out of the tree in astonishment when the car door opened, and a voguishly fashionable woman stepped out of the driver's side door. She was so beautiful that I just gawked at her from the branches of the tree, my eyes growing wider and wider every second. This was my first time to encounter a truly feminine woman. Was this really my mother's older sister? But she was so glamorous, and she looked years younger than my mother did. My brother handed me the binoculars. I studied her closely, my fingers trembling with enthusiastic excitement, as if I was on a safari in Africa encountering the elusive leopard for the very first time in my young life. In my young eyes, my aunt was equally as exotic. An unusual species of human, the likes of such I have never encountered before. Even the local woman in town never looked this glamorous. My Aunt Veronica was wearing a sassy fresh white cotton dress, covered in pretty pink flowers. She wore a narrow pink belt around her waist, and flat pink leather ballet pumps on her feet. Her long dark curly hair was held back by a pink headband, and her fair skin was flawlessly perfect, highlighted with a pretty makeup application. Her lips were a rosy red, and there was dark eyeliner on her eyes that made her eyes appear bigger than they actually were. My brother's words were, "My God, she looks like a movie star. Is that really Mum's sister? She doesn't look like Mum at all, does she? She looks like one of those ladies that you see on Dallas that J.R. Ewing likes." We watched as my father and mother came dashing out of the farmhouse, followed by 2 very enthusiastic Rhodesian Ridgebacks who were wagging their tails ebulliently. Those dogs were attached to my father like superglue, following him around everywhere he went, like the Pied Piper. Wherever my father was, there the dogs were guaranteed to be. They were well-behaved dogs who never jumped on strangers inappropriately. My easy-going mother looked animated to see her sister, and a warm smile burst out on her face, causing a plethora of lines around her eyes to crinkle up like potato chips. Next to her sister, she looked almost old, frayed, worn out and tired. They held each other in a warm embrace, as if they never wanted to let go. I could see how much my mother adored her sister Veronica. My laconic father, who naturally was reserved and uncommunicative, embraced my aunt rather ineptly, and then, thankful for a useful distraction, eagerly busied himself by removing my aunt's stylish luggage from the trunk of her car, and carried it into the house to the spare bedroom, where my aunt would be staying. My mother had lovingly prepared the guest suite for my aunt, with great attention to detail, as if she was expecting the Queen of England to be staying with us. She had flowers on the bedstands, and pretty miniature Crabtree and Evelyn shampoos and soaps in the bathroom en suite. There were brand new pink covers on the bed, and fluffy white towels in the bathroom. I'd never seen my mother go to so much trouble on anyone's account before. I remember thinking she must really love her sister. It would seem I was not wrong. Me and my brother climbed down the old oak tree, our feeble bashfulness defeated and overcome by a heightened inquisitiveness. We were eager to meet our aunt, despite the self-effacing, faint-hearted shyness that consumed our confidence like a hungry inferno. We heard my mother's crisp voice saying, "Oh, here they are, Veronica. I might have guessed they'd be hiding up in the oak tree. I'm afraid they're a little reticent and introverted. They take after their soft-spoken father in that regard." "These are my 2 children," she said proudly, pointing to the 2 of us, as if we were an unusual species of wild bird our aunt would have to strain to see. "This is Ella over here, and her older brother Stephen." Me and my brother stood there side by side, staring at my aunt in wondrous awe, like a couple of shell-shocked, gog-eyed goldfish, opening and closing our mouths, but foolishly not managing to say a single word. My mother looked slightly annoyed with us. "For goodness sake, kids, don't stand there so rudely gawking at your Aunt Veronica. You look like a pair of Venus flytraps. For goodness sake, close your mouths and say hello to your aunt." My brother and me chorused our timorous hellos together. "Hello, hello." I could feel that a few loose oak leaves had become entangled in my hair, and I sheepishly pulled them out, hoping my aunt had not noticed them. For the first time in my life, I felt so self-conscious, with my untamed wild blonde locks blowing around my face like static electricity, and the pair of rather shabby jeans I was sporting suddenly made me feel conspicuously like a tramp. I remember blushing bright red, like a field of poppies, when my aunt looked us up and down, with a big warm smile on her face. If she thought that I looked like I'd been dragged through a hedge backwards, or being rolling in the mud like a wild pig, she wisely said nothing. She was wearing a glossy red lipstick and matching nail varnish, and closer up she looked $1,000,000. I felt positively dowdy and unkept by contrast. I wanted to rush up to my bedroom, straighten my hair, scrub my face, and put on my smartest pair of dungarees, to show my Aunt Veronica I could scrub up pretty well. No one had warned me how well groomed my aunt would be, without a single hair out of place. She looked too perfect for our somewhat carelessly relaxed country home, that although cosy, was well lived in and sumptuously comfortable. "So finally we meet, children," she said. "I'm your Aunt Veronica." I was surprised to see tears spilling down her face, which she wiped away with the back of her hands. I was shocked. She was crying. Why was she so sad? People only cried when bad things happened, I thought. I'd never seen anyone openly cry before. In my family, we did not do tears. "Why are you sad?" I asked my aunt, after she took me into her arms and gave me and my brother big bear hugs that melted our reserve like butter. She looked into our faces with such an earnest, non-judgmental, loving tenderness. No one had ever looked at us quite like that before. It was as if she was studying us intently, so that every last detail of our appearance could be recorded in her mind for old time's sake, but not in a bigoted way by any manner of means. It was like she completely accepted and loved us unconditionally, exactly as we were. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. I'm crying because I'm so happy to see my niece and nephew. You have no idea how much I have longed for this special moment. I knew if I didn't come and stay with you all, I might not get to see you until you were very much older, and that would be such a dreadful shame. So much time wasted, and we wouldn't want that, would we? I was begging your mother to send you both up to Boston to stay with me, but she insisted I came here instead, although I do hasten to say I did invite myself a little presumptuously, which was a wee bit naughty of me," she said obsequiously, giving me a friendly wink. "Nonsense!" exclaimed my mother. "You know, Veronica, you're welcome here any time. You're always family." "My, you have grown so big, Ella," said Veronica, looking at me with a twinkle in her bright green eyes. "When I saw you last, you were a baby, and your brother here was just a toddler. You, Ella, look just like our mother when she was a girl of your age. You could be her twin. I've seen photographs of her. It's such a tragedy. Your grandparents aren't around to see you now. I know our mother, your grandmother, would have loved the bones of the two of you. She couldn't wait to be a grandmother. She talked tirelessly about it, how she longed for me and your mother to give her grandbabies, and looking forward to spoiling you both rotten. Now she's not here to watch you grow up. It's a dreadful pity." My Aunt Veronica began to weep again when she talked about her own parents, as if the wistful nostalgic memories of her parents had touched a very raw nerve. I'd never met anyone who cried so much before, and even though Aunt Veronica said she wasn't sad, I knew she had to be. No one could cry that much because they were happy. I was not used to witnessing real raw emotions like this, for my parents never cried, and tears were definitely an oddity in our lives, and in a space of a few minutes my aunt was like a faucet that kept raining down tears. One thing was for sure: if she lived in a barren wilderness, it would become like the hanging gardens of Babylon, with all that extra water supply running down from my aunt's cheeks. "Where are they?" I asked, looking at her bemused. "You mean your grandparents?" she asked me. I shook my head of blonde hair vigorously and studied my aunt's face for her answer. For a moment Veronica's green eyes looked somewhat startled. She stopped crying at once, wiping the residue of her tears away with her thumbs. Her painted red lips quivered awkwardly, and she glanced up at my mother, as if she was worried she was speaking out of turn, and had said something that my little callow ears were not supposed to hear. My mother gave her an encouraging nod, to reassure her she could talk to us about anything, as in our household we kept no clandestine secrets from each other. Our lives were most usually an open book. "Your grandparents, I'm sure your mother has told you before. Well, maybe you forgot. Well, they died in a car accident before you were born. I was the lucky one. I survived that nasty crash." "Oh," I said, "I forgot they died. Why did you not get hurt if you were in the same car with them?" "Well, you see, the car went plunging into a tree. The front of their car was very badly damaged. I was in the back seat. I was lucky. Yes, I did get injured badly, but I was fortunate to survive that accident after several lengthy surgeries. I had what they called a radical hysterectomy. Do you know what that is?" I shook my head. "Sorry, I don't know what it is." "It means I can't have children," she said to me. "You see, I haven't got the right apparatus anymore. It was damaged in the accident. The doctors saved my life by removing those parts. So you two children are even more precious to me, as I can't have my own. Which reminds me," said my aunt, "I've got some presents for the both of you." When my aunt handed me a parcel, I was astonished to discover it contained 2 pretty flowery dresses, and I had never owned a dress in my life. I was ecstatic. Maybe I could look like a film star too, I thought happily. My brother was given a fabulous water pistol, and while I envied his amazing gift, I was incredibly happy to be the owner of such pretty dresses, for I had never owned anything this special in my life, as on our farm I lived in dungarees, jeans, shorts and T-shirts, and owning a dress was a frivolous extravagance. My mother always said, "If we buy you a dress, Ella, it'll be a waste of money. It'll just get shredded within days on the farm. We need to be practical here." I remember my little heart had felt really sad, but now I had 2 dresses in my wardrobe that I was scared to ever wear. I wanted them to stay absolutely perfect. I remember after my Aunt Veronica came to stay with us, I would watch her with wide eyes, for she was the only source of femininity that had really touched my life. I would observe her graceful movements, the way she reapplied the glossy red colour to her lips, the way she smiled so prettily and tossed her hair when she laughed. Granted, I'd seen women at church, dressed to the nines, wearing their Sunday best, but my aunt, she was different. She didn't even own a single pair of jeans, and practicality of any kind was flung to the wayside if in any way it compromised her femininity. Veronica was the complete antithesis of my mother, but despite their remarkable differences, she and my mother were incredibly close. While Aunt Veronica was around, I didn't play with my brother so much, which annoyed him greatly. While he understood I found my aunt like a refreshing pretty painting I wanted to study all day long, he thought that I would soon become bored of staring at her. "Right, I get you think Aunt Veronica is pretty and that, and she wears nice clothes, but why don't we go and play? Surely you don't want to hang around her all day, when we could be having fun playing cops and robbers or messing around in the stables. But I like to watch Aunt Veronica. You do know it's rude to stare, sis." "I'm not staring," I insisted. "You are, sis. You stare at her all the time. I see you staring." My brother gave me a disparaging look and stormed off indignantly. In the beginning he'd been beguiled by my aunt, but the shine soon wore off for him, and he wanted to get back to roughing it in the countryside, and was not best pleased by my fixation on my Aunt Veronica, as he didn't enjoy playing his outdoor games solo, and felt as if I had abandoned him for an adult, which was nonsensical to him. The trouble was that my Aunt Veronica never became boring to me, not once. I studied her with an intense curiosity. I'd sit down at the breakfast nook, while my mother was bustling around the kitchen, stirring away at a bubbling pot of homemade jam, while listening to my aunt talk. My aunt had a beautiful voice. I'd hang on to her every word. It was hard to take my eyes off her, as even her eloquent, crisp way she communicated grabbed my attention with the allure of an actress at a theatre that captivates an entire audience. She was like a fabulous butterfly in the meadow. I'd never met anyone quite like her before. I often chased butterflies in the alpine meadow, while the horses frolicked in the field. They were so pretty. I'd let them perch on the back of my hand, as I was bedazzled by their exquisite, beautiful wings, and then I'd watch them fly away, bobbing from one pretty flower to the next, dancing like ethereal fairies. My aunt had that kind of mesmerizing effect on me, like a pop star might have on their fans. In my small little sheltered world, my aunt was like a rock star to me, a role model of whose lead I would like to surely follow. I hoped that one day I might look as elegant as she did. "So how are things going with you and Alf?" my mother asked her. I knew that Aunt Veronica had met a handsome man about a year and a half ago, as my mother had spoken of it often enough to me and my brother. So we were well versed in the subject of my aunt's love life, that over the years had been a roller coaster of adventure. We knew she had phoned my mother in the middle of the night once, only hours after meeting Alf McAllister, declaring that she had found the quintessential love of her life, the man she would be certain to marry. Well, that's what she told my mother. "Oh, sis, you'll never believe what's happened," she had said to my mother, whom had thought that my sister was about to impart some devastating news. Nothing good ever came from those late-night calls, so my mother trembled with fear when she took that phone call. "Is everything all right, Veronica?" my mother had asked, unable to disguise the rising angst in her voice. Had her sister had an accident? Was she in hospital? Had something terrible happened? All these agonizing, troublesome thoughts whirled around in my mother's head as she took the call, while the palms of her hands sweated in apprehension. "Oh, everything is just wonderful, sis," Veronica had said nonchalantly. "Couldn't be better as it happens." "Veronica, you gave me the hell of a shock, phoning me at this god-awful hour. You do realise it's past midnight," my mother had grumbled. I know, sis, but I can't keep this in. I was bursting to tell you my phenomenal news. I do believe I've met my knight in shining armour. Oh, he's gorgeous, sis. Dark hair, the body of a Greek god, and eyes that are like deep pools of melted chocolate that I could actually eat. He is perfect, sis, and he oozes charm, like honey over a waffle. I think I'm head over heels in love with him, sis. His name is Angus McAllister, and he is the epitome of a refined gentleman." "Glad to hear it, Veronica," my mother had replied gingerly. Veronica could be so impulsive, always had been as a girl. Nothing had changed in that regard. Even though she was the older sister, my mother had been the one who had assumed that role, as my mother was so grounded with her feet firmly on the ground, while Veronica, like a butterfly, seemed to always be airborne, a little flighty perhaps. She needed to be brought back down to earth, or be tethered to her mooring place like a frisky houseboat. "Look, sis, I don't want you to get your hopes up. You've only just met this man," my mother had told Aunt Veronica. "Just take things slowly, that's my advice, one step at a time. See where it goes. You know what happened last time you thought you met the one? It all went pear-shaped." "I know, sis, but this is different. Alf, he's perfect. He's so perfect." Suffice to say, the relationship had blossomed, and it seemed very likely that Veronica and Alf would tie the knot. But one big obstacle lay between them, like a lonely island in the Pacific, an obstacle that Veronica had been afraid to broach with her boyfriend, for fear of losing him, and that was her inability to have children. This was a secret she held tightly to her chest, that she was unwilling to divulge to any of her suitors. My mother's abrupt, unexpected question about her sister's relationship with Alf had provoked Veronica to tears that spilled down her face unapologetically. My mother quickly handed her a box of tissues, which Veronica snatched from her, gratefully blowing her nose hard. "Don't upset yourself, Veronica. Nothing can be that bad, surely. The last time I spoke to you, you were convinced Alf was going to pop the question to you. What's happened between then and now?" "Oh, you must excuse me, sis. What am I like? You must think I'm a big baby." "Of course I don't, Veronica," my mother said kindly, resting her reassuring weathered hand on her sister's perfectly manicured one, giving it a tight, encouraging squeeze. My mother had stopped bustling around the kitchen and had seated herself down next to me, opposite her sister, at the breakfast nook. She stared at her sister intently, with very troubled eyes. My mother always used to say that the only family she had left was Veronica, so her relationship with her sister meant the world to her. My mother seemed to become very protective over Veronica when she was upset, fussing around her like a mother hen, and now was no different. "So tell me, what went wrong with you and Alf? I thought it was written in the stars that the two of you would ultimately get married. What the hell happened? You never told me anything." "We split up after he proposed to me. That was 3 days ago, before I was due to visit you. I was meaning to tell you, but I was just too upset," said Veronica, bursting into tears. "Calm down, Veronica. Don't cry. Why would Alf callously jilt you after proposing to you? I thought the two of you were hopelessly in love. What could have gone so badly wrong to mess it up like this?" "Well, I told him that I couldn't have children," Veronica blurted out. "You should have seen him, sis. His face, it went as white as a sheet. He grew very grave. I knew in that moment it was over between us, that I'd lost him. I think my inability to have children is a deal breaker for him." "But I don't understand, Veronica. Did you not tell him long ago about your hysterectomy? I thought you told me he was fine about it, and you had discussed it intently with him. I lied, sis. I lied. I know it was wrong. You kept telling me to broach the subject, and you told me I needed to be upfront about my issue. But I was so terrified if I told him the truth, he'd leave me. I meant to tell him, but every time I came close to telling him, I lost my nerve, and I simply panicked. I was sure he'd bolt out of my life like a stallion from a stable. I just never got around to telling him the truth. I was afraid it would completely destroy what we had together. You see, having children is so important to Alf. He kept talking about how he looked forward to having children one day. I didn't have the heart to tell him that I could never have kids. But when he proposed to me, I knew I had to be honest with him. I didn't want to get married with a great lie between us. That's no way to start a married life. I just didn't expect him to react so adversely, as if I'd cheated on him. What did he say when you told him this? I imagine it must have come as a shock, my mother asked her sister tenderly. He was so angry with me for not telling him a long time ago. He said that our relationship was over and had been based on a lie, and he didn't want to marry me any more. He told me I was treacherously deceitful. Veronica began to sob. Please don't cry, Aunt Veronica. I don't want you to be sad, I said to her. You're so sweet, Ella, said my aunt. You're such a sensitive little girl for one so young. But I brought this on myself. I was a complete and total coward. I don't think that this is the train smash that you think it is, sis, my mother said. You need to give Alf time. Come around to the fact that you cannot have his biological children. That can be very hard for a man to accept, you know. It must have come as a dreadful shock to him to hear about your plight. I warned you, sis, from the very beginning to be upfront and honest with him. Alf loves you. My bet is he will not be able to envisage his life without you. There are other ways childless couples can have children, you know. There's adoption, for example. I believe adopting children is not much more different to having your own. But you don't understand, sis. I think Alf feels I betrayed his trust. And he's right, I did. I know he's right. I don't think he can ever forgive me for this, and I don't blame him. Trust is a big deal for him. Having children of his own that are biologically his is also significantly important to him, and I have to respect him for that. Veronica, we need to talk about this later. I've got to get going. I've got some work to do in the fields, said my mother, drying her hands with a kitchen towel. But Ella, why don't you take your Aunt Veronica into the woodgrove? It'll cheer her up. Oh, I'm not sure it's a good idea. I'm not exactly very athletic. Besides, I'm not kitted out to walk in the woods. Look at my clothes. I don't even own a pair of walking shoes. Oh, go on, Veronica. It'll do you good, said my mother. And I've got a pair of walking boots that should fit you just fine. Me and my mother managed to successfully talk Veronica into taking a casual stroll with me into the woodgrove. We had no idea where my brother was, but I was actually pleased he was not around to interfere with our fun. Me and my aunt began to walk in the woodgrove, where the lofty trees from American beeches, coffee, northern red oaks and eastern pines stood together in a cheerful, eclectic mix, like a never-ending congregation of parishioners at a church, all decked out in their individualistic finery. The trees in the woodgrove were like that. My aunt looked magnificent in her flowery dress, and my mother's very masculine walking shoes served to make her look all the more fragile and delicate, like an alpine flower in the meadow. It was hard to take my eyes off her, especially as she was wearing a beautiful aquamarine quartz necklace that caught the light. She told me that Alf had given it to her as a present. He must have really loved her, I thought. But why did he care so much that she couldn't have his children? Was it really such a big deal? I knew my mother was right, and that a walk in the trees would do Veronica the world of good. It was impossible to remain sad in the woodgrove in my experience. It was our family go-to place to gravitate when our spirits were low. I think there's something spiritually mollifying about walking among the trees. It's like these verdant, imposing masters of nature almost minister to your soul, like great gurus of wisdom who help put things into perspective for you. It's a little like the seasoned forest becomes your therapy session, as the mellifluent trills of the birds in the trees, the playful squirrels bounding up the branches, and the floral woody notes of the woodgrove's natural bouquets all play their sweet reverential roles in counselling you out of your lugubrious melancholia and uplift any flagging spirits. It's like that when you're walking in nature. Your troubles shrivel up, like from a large plum into a dry prune, and you realize whatever was eating you up from the inside out was not that significant after all. The towering, unflappable trees make your problems appear as minuscule as a grain of dust. As we walked down the earthen trails of the woods, my eyes ardently drank in the viridescent resplendence of the woodland foliage, furnished so lavishly with frilly ferns and woodland shrubs. The forest was so musical, as the euphonious, tuneful birdsong serenaded our walk. The ground beneath our feet was soft to the touch, but we crunched leaves and broken twigs and bracken beneath the forceful rubber soles of our boots. Sometimes we would meet the natural barricades that nature presents, that blocked our path, like a wild bush growing in an unbefitting place, so much so that we had to wheedle past. Sometimes it was a tight squeeze, or an unexpected log carpeted in a rich verdant moss lying in the middle of the trees. It was fun navigating our way over the occasional obstacle course. The act of just walking across this richly fertile earthen floor was incredibly grounding. It was a fabulous day. The prisms of sunlight danced through the branches of the trees, casting their shimmering, refulgent reflections over the umbrage, so that every leafy thing was brushed in a golden sheen that was beguilingly prepossessing. I glanced up briefly at my aunt's pretty heart-shaped face, to see if the woodgrove had impacted her as positively as it always did me. It seemed to have been working its magic on her. I could see she had physically relaxed. The anxious, vanquished look she had worn only moments before had dissipated. She gave me a warm smile when she met my eyes and whispered, "It's so beautiful, Ella. I'm glad I came." We didn't need to talk. The mellow, affable atmosphere of the woods hugged us from every side. I felt as if we were walking among old, wizened friends that were bustering us up on every side, so that the broken springs of my aunt's emotions were being repaired steadily, like an old violin or guitar. There was a cool breeze blowing in the woods. It nuzzled our cheeks affectionately, and permitted the boughs of the trees to seesaw up and down. All of a sudden, both me and Veronica stood very still. We were both certain we had heard something. But as we cocked up our ears to listen more intently, like two very alert dogs, we heard nothing. We continued happily on our way, and I had this overwhelming sense that we were not on our own, and that we were being followed. I was sure as we were walking, something else began to walk in tune with us. When we stopped, so did they. I was absolutely certain I had heard twigs snap, and the ground beneath me vibrate. Had I imagined it? I turned around to look behind me. Everything looked exactly the same. Nothing was moving. Nothing looked suspiciously as if someone was hiding in our midst. No one was there. And yet the feeling that we were being followed was overwhelmingly strong, and it wouldn't leave my gut instincts alone. "Is someone following us?" asked Veronica uneasily, her green eyes growing fearful and her top lip quivering. "I have a profound sense we're being watched. I thought I heard someone stomping on the ground behind us, breaking twigs. I'm sure I didn't imagine it." I did not want my aunt to be unduly nervous, so I nonchalantly shrugged my shoulders and said, "It always feels like that in the woods. There are many animals that hide in plain sight, you see. You probably heard a deer or something. I often scare them off when I come into the woods at times. It could have even been a wild turkey, They can be quite noisy, you know. If there's something in here, they're more scared of us than we are of them. That's what my dad always tells me. My aunt looked heartily relieved, while I remained apprehensive, wondering if someone was indeed following us. But who? I kept looking behind me nervously, and then I saw a swift movement and a flash of black take cover behind a tree. And then a curious, human-looking face peered at us, or more to the point, stared directly at Veronica. What the hell was that? I wondered. Veronica had seen what I'd observed and pointed at the tree with a huge smile on her face. I saw a face! Someone is there! She didn't sound afraid, only intrigued. I think it's your brother, she giggled. He's trying to scare us. He doesn't fool me, not for a moment. Veronica ran to the tree, giggling. We know you're there, Stephen. You can come out now. You don't scare me for a moment. I saw your face looking at me. I said nothing. I knew that whatever had been peeking at us behind the tree was not Stephen. My blood ran cold. I tried to stop Veronica from rushing over to the tree, but my jaw was locked so tightly that I couldn't shout out to stop her. That was when I saw the creature stepping away from the tree and standing there very still. I was expecting Veronica to scream, but she stood there like a frozen statue, doing nothing. I have no idea what her expression was like, because she was standing in front of me, so I couldn't see her face. My heart began to swing in my chest like a large pendulum, and my legs felt like jello beneath me, and I was quite sure I was going to faint from shock. My chest tightened so much that I could barely breathe. The extraordinary creature standing before us was a male Bigfoot. He was enormous in every sense of the word, and so human-looking I could hardly believe it. I have never seen such a lofty, powerful physique before, so densely muscular, taut with definition, without a single ounce of fat. I knew he was all male. I sensed that masculine energy, that powerful, dignified bearing that reminds you are in the presence of a great, illustrious warrior. The Bigfoot could easily have been 9 foot tall, possibly more, 700 to 800 pounds at a guess, based on just how burly and powerful he was. But his face was so human, his gait remarkably graceful, his demeanour gentle, benevolent, kind. He displayed absolutely no aggression. He seemed so mellow, easy-going, peaceful and carefree. I noticed his dark, soulful eyes were fixed directly on Veronica, and there was admiration in those eyes. I have seen that look when people admire a great work of art. I realized that the Bigfoot was looking at my aunt in that way, like admiring a Picasso at the Tate Art Gallery in London. His lively brown eyes seemed to dance with merriment, as if he was smiling at us. I do think he thought my aunt was very beautiful. I regret to say he didn't look at me in that way, but I was wearing a pair of dungarees and looked as plain as a piece of paper, but one that was infinitely more dirty. My aunt was standing there, stoically still, and I think she and the Bigfoot had a moment of telepathic communication and connection between them, but what he was saying to her I would not know at that time. Then the Bigfoot began to run his hands through my aunt's silken hair, and she didn't appear to mind at all. He was purring like a cat almost. Ah, ah. And then I heard the words in my head, quite lovely, quite lovely. That was when I heard Veronica giggle. Are you kidding me? Was she finding this funny? I certainly wasn't. Well, not at first. I mean, meeting a creature like this was incredibly intimidating. But I realized the Bigfoot meant us no harm. I could see the kind twinkle in his eyes. He turned around to look directly at me and gave me a warm nod. He then nodded at Veronica and turned around and glided away, moving with such an incredible grace. Veronica was tickled pink about our strange encounter with the Bigfoot. Oh, my God, Ella! Did you see him? Oh, so handsome, so big! scary, but he had nice eyes. But I could tell he was benevolent. Benevolent, Ella? He was a great big teddy bear with a huge heart. Couldn't you tell that? Do you know what he said to me, Ella? I looked at my aunt nonplussed. But he didn't speak to us, I said. Oh, but he did, Ella. He spoke to me in my head. It's called telepathic communication. He told me not to be afraid. He was a friend. He was sorry to stare, but he thought I was beautiful, and he asked me if he could touch my hair. So I said yes to him, not audibly, but in my head, of course. When he touched my hair, he said, quite lovely, quite lovely. Oh, I did hear that in my head, I admitted. Oh, my word, Ella, there are no words. There are just no words. I'm sorry, but there just aren't. Did you see his muscles? Have you ever seen such a man's man in your life? I mean, he positively oozed testosterone from every pore of his body. I tell you, Ella, I would feel safe with him watching over me any day of the week. We both giggled. I laughed and she laughed. I remember thinking that my aunt had developed a crush on the Bigfoot we encountered. She was almost glowing from the unlikely encounter, and her face was blushing, the colour of a pink rose. Her upset over Alf seemed to have long since departed, as her wondrous awe over the Bigfoot we encountered had taken central stage of all her focus. I hasten to say, a short while later, when we heard someone walking towards us, my aunt's face lit up like a Christmas tree. She giggled and said, I think he's coming back, Ella. I think the handsome Bigfoot is coming back. Maybe he wants to touch my hair again. He's so welcome. When she saw the man walking towards us was not the Bigfoot, I could see the disappointment on her face. What do you want? She said in a brusque, irritated manner to the man that trudged towards us. He was wearing a smart pair of chinos and a red polo top. That's not a very nice welcome, V, he said. I thought you might be a wee bit happier to see me. I was told I would find you here, said the man, wrapping his arms around my aunt. I've missed you, sweetheart, he said, giving her a kiss on the cheek, which she quickly brushed away in disgust with the back of her hand. I don't think there is anything left to say, Alf. You made your feelings perfectly clear. Go away. I don't want to see you any more. I've met someone else, if you must know, who's infinitely more handsome than you are, and has a body to die for that you could only ever dream of acquiring, she said cuttingly. Is that so? Said the man, raising a brow. Please don't push me away, V. You know I love you. All right, I admit it, I messed up. But I don't care. I've been thinking about it. If you can't have kids, it's not a train smash. I just can't live without you. That would be the train smash. You haven't replaced me already, have you? With a hunkier man? Goodness gracious, V, that is fast work, he said, putting on a very hurt expression on his face that made me and my aunt burst into fits of laughter. I realized this was my aunt's boyfriend Alf, and he had quite the sense of humour on him that made me warm to him at once. I've just met someone very desirable, haven't I? Said my aunt, giving me a wink. Why would I ever want you after the incredible hunk that I've just encountered? She has too. I promise you, he's very big and handsome. In that case, said the man, getting on his hands and knees, I better strike while the iron is hot. I can't face the competition. Veronica, will you do me the honour of becoming my wife? My aunt squealed in delight, and we both hugged each other so tightly. Veronica and Alf were so caught up in their loving embrace that they were not aware that the Bigfoot had actually returned. He was standing there very stoically, and in his hands he was carrying two pawpaws. He got my attention, and put the pawpaws onto the ground. I realized he was gifting them to us. He nodded at me and walked away. His timing couldn't have been better, because we were going back to the farmhouse to celebrate Aunt Veronica's great news. She was getting married to Alf. We needed to crack open the champagne and the pawpaws. 2 years later. I was 12 years old at the time. It was 1984, the year I would never be allowed to ever forget. The year that intrudes into my mind all these years later, like an angry pustule that has broken out on the face. It was the year I was forced to face my biggest fears. I'm glad to say my Aunt Veronica soon married her Alf, and since our serendipitous encounter with the Bigfoot, I'd never ever seen the tall, lofty creature again. Of course, I told my brother about our extraordinary encounter in the woodgrove, and he sulked for weeks, complaining that if Aunt Veronica had not come to stay, that maybe the two of us would have encountered the Bigfoot for ourselves. It's not fair. When Aunt Veronica was here, you didn't want to hang around me any more. You were so beguiled by her. It was pathetic. If we'd been together, we'd have seen the Bigfoot ourselves, as a team. I told him it was unlikely that we would have both encountered that male Bigfoot. I was sure he had seen us around the farm for years, but not been particularly interested in either of us. That revelation went down with my brother like a lead balloon. Why would he not be interested in us? What's so special about Aunt Veronica? He chided caustically. Why would he be interested in her? Because don't you remember when we saw Aunt Veronica for the first time, you have to admit she looked like a film star. You don't see people like her in these parts, do you? She's so feminine. I mean, look at me. I'm virtually a tomboy. I never look pretty, nor does Mum. You're a boy, so the male Bigfoot's not going to have a crush on you either, even if you wore Aunt Veronica's dresses and her bright red lipstick. I think the big burly male Bigfoot picked up how feminine Aunt Veronica was. He was attracted to her female energy. He showed himself to us, 'cause he fancied Aunt Veronica. He was touching her hair. He thought she was beautiful, like a butterfly in the woodgrove. I'm sure he sees humans before, but no one as feminine as Aunt Veronica. That's attractive to a powerful male Bigfoot that's got lots and lots of testosterone. In those 2 years after my Bigfoot encounter, I looked for any signs of the male Bigfoot. I wanted to see him again, but I doubted I ever would, and in truth that did make me sad. I even wore my aunt's pretty frocks that she'd brought me in the woodgrove to attract the Bigfoot's attention, but I could never carry off that feminine look like my Aunt Veronica so effortlessly did. So nothing really worked. I needed to be like a butterfly on a flower for the Bigfoot to pay any attention to me. I was sure he was out there, but I never saw him again, and thought I never would. One day something terrible happened, when me and my brother were playing a regular game of cowboys and Indians in the woodgrove. We never indulged ourselves in girly games together. For a start, my brother would never have played anything sissy, and I didn't know any girls' games to be played, for I never grew up around feminine influences, and never once owned a doll. On this occasion, it was, as usual, a prepossessingly beautiful day, and it was on days like this that me and my brother would be naturally drawn into the woodgrove, like iron filings to a magnet. The cobalt blue sky was cloudless, a never-ending vast blue ocean. The weather was warm, but not unpleasantly hot. There was a cool breeze blowing, and the verdant giants of the woodgrove swooshed their leaves like a cheerleader's pom-poms. The forest was pleasantly cool, the canopy intertwined by branches that weaved themselves audaciously together in an elegant archway above our heads that allowed only a small amount of light to trespass through the boughs and to pepper the forest in a kind of rainbow-like prism that you see in a disco ball, but lots and lots of them. As we entered the forest, I immediately felt chills run down my spine. The forest carried a foreboding atmosphere that lingered around us like an odious bad smell. My father had sagaciously warned us once that if the forest went deadly quiet, then there was a predator in our midst. We should have paid attention to his words and got the hell out of the woods. But me and my brother Stephen were more curious and inquisitive than afraid, eager to try and comprehend what the very pronounced feeling of trepidation that had held the woodgrove hostage was all about. Suffice to say, even the tall, lofty trees seemed to whisper to us warningly, "Get out, get out, get out." My brother looked at me and said, "The woods have never felt this uncongenial before. Do you suppose that there is a mountain lion in here?" His voice sounded rather excited, as my brother was partial to wild cats, and had several posters of lions and tigers on his bedroom wall. He said when he was older he wanted to be a game ranger in Africa. "If there is, then I think we ought to get the hell out of here. A mountain lion could kill us, and we haven't got any means of protection." "You're right," said my brother. "We better make tracks back to the house." But I could see the mere thought that a mountain lion might be sniffing around us had made my brother's eyes shine like polished bronze. That was when we heard it. It was a loud scream. It sounded like my mother's voice, as if she was in desperate trouble. But then what was she doing in the woodgrove? I thought she was in the kitchen at home, making bread. "It's Mum," said my brother, looking alarmed. "Something is attacking her." Me and my brother hurriedly ran towards the sound of my mother's scream. And as we got closer to the sound, we smelt the foulest stench consuming our nostrils. It smelt like decaying flesh. The smell was vile, repugnant. My eyes began to water, and I felt as if I wanted to throw up the contents of my stomach. The back of my throat was burning. Even today, that god-awful smell still haunts my darkest nightmares, for I don't even think a dead corpse could smell this bad. But I stand to be corrected. That was when we saw him. He was standing on the branch of a red oak tree, looking down at us arrogantly, with a haughty swagger to his demeanour, and vicious bright red eyes that burned into us like fiery coals. My heart heaved like a heavy piece of furniture being pushed reluctantly across the floor, as I found myself staring at the most despicable creature I have ever laid eyes on. Even today, I do not know what he was, but I knew this: he was vindictively evil. The creature was screaming in my mother's voice. Me and my brother stood there, paralyzed to the spot, stupefied by what we were perceiving. I think when you're so astounded by something you are witnessing, you convince yourself, it's not real, it's not real, it's not real. It's as if you've dived into an alternative reality which will pass from you as quickly as a sneeze. Yet as I stood there and closed my eyes tightly for a brief second, to will the ugly, obnoxious vision that had scribbled itself onto our reality away, I opened my eyes again to see the creature was there smirking at us. We had obliviously walked headlong into his trap, like two lambs to the slaughter, my mother's voice being a cunning ruse for us. The humanoid creature, with its dog-like influences, was easily 7 foot tall. He was long, athletic and nimble, with a long tail, like a dog, but not nearly as powerful and burly as the Bigfoot I had encountered. Suffice to say, this ghastly dog-like humanoid possessed the strength of 4 men, with a densely well-developed muscular body, covered in short black hair with rust markings. The creature stood up like a man on 2 feet. Only his broad head, with its rounded forehead, was exceedingly intimidating, and his huge dog-like muzzle was incredibly well developed, with a jaw of jagged canine teeth that were menacingly smiling at us. He glared at us through soulless dead eyes, and we watched in horror as globs of thick spittle drooled out of his mouth, dropping to the forest floor, flecked with blood, probably the remnants of his last meal. I could swear the grotesquely ugly, devilish creature was salivating, but I regret to say his hungry, insatiable eyes were not pinned on my brother Stephen, but directly focused on me. He wasn't looking at me like the Bigfoot had stared at Aunt Veronica, Nothing of the kind. There was nothing warm or emotional in his stare. His cold, dark eyes drilled into me like a jackhammer, and it was as if he was saying, "I want to kill you and eat you up." I observed that his shoulders were pronounced, his arms long, but his hands possessed powerful claws. He was agile and nimble on his feet. I knew that it was me he was after. It was me he wanted. His gaze never wavered in my brother's direction, not even once. My brother had sensed this. He screamed to me. "Run!" my brother screamed. "For God's sake, Ella, run as fast as you can! It's you he wants, not me!" I realized my brother would have easily sacrificed himself on my account, and would be happy to do so, just so that I could get home to the house safely, and this creature could devour him instead. But this creature did not want Stephen. "It's you he's after, Ella! You've got to run!" my brother screamed again. I bounced out of my frozen stupor and hurriedly obeyed my brother's commands. He was throwing stones at the creature, trying desperately to distract it, to stop it successfully from gaining any ground on me. But it willfully ignored him and was lunging towards me, leaving my brother a long way behind him. I was trying to run as fast as I could. My legs crumbled beneath me. My breathing was fast and furious. I tried to push my body as hard as I possibly could, but my feeble small frame had its physical limitations, and I was straining to move any faster. My feet felt as if they were encased in cement. I could taste death on my tongue. I was a hair's breadth away from losing my life. I knew I could never outwit this creature. I didn't stand a chance of outrunning him. He was now close behind me. I could feel his moist, foul-smelling breath on the back of my neck. In a trice, a clawed hand grabbed me by the collar of my shirt, and I was lifted off the ground. He threw me onto his shoulders. Now I knew where this vile stench was coming from. This horrendous creature vomited out this stench from every cell of his body, which clung to him like the filth in a doormat. I screamed to my brother, "Help, Stephen! Help! Help me! Help me!" But it was no use. I was beyond any help now. I knew it. My brother knew it. The creature held me down with his clawed hand that dug into my body so sharply that those claws punctured my skin, so that blood oozed out of my wounds. I've never known a fear like I did in that moment, as the creature ran away with me. My teeth chattered in my jaws, even though it wasn't remotely cold. He was so nimble on his feet and as fast as the wind, and my brother's frantic, desperate calls became fainter and fainter and fainter on the wind. I wiggled on his back, tried desperately to escape, but it was all futile. My heart thundered violently in my chest so fast that it was almost as if my entire body had become one booming heartbeat. I was now resigned to the fact that my death was almost certainly imminent. No one could save me now. I was dinner for this creature. All of a sudden, the forest heaved and boomed. The ground vibrated as heavy, ponderous feet galloped towards us at a thunderously fast pace. Something behind us began to scream loudly with a furious indignance. The creature turned around to face the intruder, running towards us. I looked up from its shoulders, and to see what I perceived was the male Bigfoot that I'd encountered with my aunt in the woods 2 years prior. I could feel relief washing over my face, hope plunging itself into my heart like a rock being thrown into a lake. I could see a rainbow of light peering at me hopefully in the darkness of my plight, for this dog-like humanoid was no match for the Bigfoot. I knew in my heart that the big, burly Bigfoot was here to rescue me from this malicious predator. Ostensibly, there was nothing nice about the Bigfoot's demeanour as he faced my tormentor. I could see hatred in his eyes as he glared at the creature. The Bigfoot began pounding his chest, oscillating his arms, and growling viciously. "Ah! Ah!" The But even I felt my heart boom from the sheer intimidation of the Bigfoot's impending threats. The Bigfoot was pointing at me. The next thing I knew, the dog-like humanoid whimpered like a coyote in pain and surrendered in defeat. It just dropped me from its shoulders. I would have hit the ground very hard if the Bigfoot had not caught me in time. The big dog-like humanoid made a terrified shriek like a frightened coyote and hightailed it into the woods. He had been afraid of the Bigfoot, that was for sure. He had given up his trophy just to get away. I could hear his whimpering shrieks as he disappeared from our sight. "Are you all right?" the Bigfoot asked me telepathically, a clear voice that I heard in my head. I nodded. "I'm taking you home," said the voice. The Bigfoot threw me on his shoulders and then ran through the woods. We found my brother sitting on the forest floor, crying his eyes out. I knew he hadn't gone home to call for help. He knew it was over for me. It was all too late. There was nothing anyone could do to save me, and he would have been right about that. We didn't do tears in our household. My brother had buried his face in his hands and was sitting on the forest floor in such a deflated heap of despair. But on sensing he was not alone, he looked up through red puffy eyes to see the Bigfoot standing there with me on his shoulders. My brother watched me as if he was caught up in a daze as the Bigfoot lowered me gently on the ground. I ran towards my brother and we embraced, holding each other tightly as if we could never ever let each other go, and we were sobbing with relief, our tears completely saturating each other's clothes. "I thought you were dead. I thought we'd lost you forever." "He saved me," I said, pointing to the Bigfoot through my tears. "He rescued me from that horrible thing, whatever it was." I am not sure how long we stood there embracing. The Bigfoot watched us for a while, but as soon as he had our attention, he spoke to us in a strange language that we miraculously understood, almost as if the meaning of the words were downloaded into our head. "Kilamo natina, agila kwanzila no fagana pakina." Go home now. I need to go after that scum and kill him, for he is a threat to this wood grove and everything in its midst. Dangina katom pasi, hafikana katwali kasi. Nothing with him is safe. He only kills to eat, but he kills for pleasure and entertainment. He nodded, and as we watched him running through the woods at a vast speed, swinging his arms backwards and forwards, moving through the trees like a charging elephant, I knew without a doubt that the Bigfoot would kill that horrible dog-like humanoid, and I was very glad about that. Me and my brother returned to our stone house, knowing that our lives would never be quite the same ever again, for we had come face to face with our most horrifying fears, that until that moment I believed existed only in nightmares or fairy tales. Me and my brother wisely decided between the two of us we would never ever tell my parents what had happened, for we didn't want our lives to be robbed of the freedom we always enjoyed on the farm, and we did not want our parents to be exposed to the revelation of the horror we had endured. We wanted to save them from that. My brother cleaned up my injuries with disinfectant, and although me and my brother looked as if the life had been drained out of us, we remained stoically composed, so our parents did not suspect a thing. We could never let them know what had transpired. The next day, me and my brother discovered, to our delight, the deceased body of the huge dog-like humanoid lying in our woodgrove, looking as if the life had been bludgeoned out of him. I knew the Bigfoot had left it there to tell us that all was safe in the woods again, and that he had killed the beast for us. We were ever grateful for what he had done, and we buried the large beast in the meadow with my father's trowel, unbeknown to him, so that my father would never encounter its dead corpse and wonder what the hell it was. I hasten to say we only saw the Bigfoot fleetingly a handful of times since then, but he was always so friendly to us, giving us a warm nod, and the words, "Go well with you," would sweep into our heads. My brother and I always felt safe in the woodgrove, knowing the male Bigfoot was around, watching over us, and we also knew that should we ever be in need again, help would arrive for us faster than a jackrabbit from an unlikely source. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I will never forget the day my father invited Mildred Donahue to our farmhouse for a meal. It was a day that would take my life down a downward trajectory. I had been told that a very nice lady was coming to dinner, but my father seemed rather flustered as he began to prepare the meal long in advance, as if his entire day was devoted to preparing for this very special visitor. My father was behaving enigmatically. Normally he brought ready-prepared food from the store in town, all the local delicatessens that made ready-made home-style food very palatable, like mac and cheese and meatballs with pasta, which we would shove into the microwave to heat up, and together with the food on our trays, we would eat our meals in front of the television set. After my mother's fortuitous death, we no longer sat at the dinner table as a family, which was very sad indeed. Alas, these days the dinner table resembled a tool shed, as everything but the kitchen sink had somehow found its way on its surface. So even if we wanted to eat at the table, it would be an impossibility unless we cleaned the living room up, and that wasn't going to happen in a hurry. One glance at our home, and you would know unequivocally there was no woman around, for all the feminine touches had long since faded away. I wondered why my father was going to such trouble on account of a complete stranger, and decided to myself that she must be rather important. It never occurred to my naive, rather ignorant mind that my father might have romantic aspirations towards this woman. He could never replace my mother, and my father had assured me of that. Foolishly I had taken him at his word, and I don't doubt he meant it at the time. But loneliness can do strange things to a man. "Your mother, Kurt, was the light of my life," he told me, "and now that light has been so cruelly expunged, so we are going to have to learn to live without her. It means we're going to have to both be very brave, but your mum would not want us to be sad, would she?" I had nodded in agreement through my tears. I knew he was right. My mother would have hated us to bask in our melancholia. "But why did she have to die, Daddy? It's not fair," I protested, trying to disguise the desperate wail in my voice. I didn't want my father to think I was a big baby. It was only girls that cried, but it was hard not to be upset about her loss. When my father was not looking, I don't mind admitting I would allow a few tears to slip down my cheeks, which I would hurriedly wipe away with a great deal of shame and self-disgust. "Boys don't cry," I told myself again and again. Like a constant mantra, I repeated to myself tirelessly every day. If I ever sensed I was in danger of shedding tears, I would always think about those brave American soldiers that went to fight for our country in Afghanistan, and so forth. They had to be courageous and strong. You never heard of any of them breaking down in tears, so neither should I. "I know it's not fair, Kurt," said my father, taking me into his strong, reassuring arms to give me a warm cuddle. "Who said life was ever fair? Life is a journey, you know. And sometimes, Sport, bad things happen to good people that are beyond our control. If I can offer you any solace, Sport, there is not a person living on this planet that has not experienced loss of some kind. It is part of the fabric of human nature." He paused for a moment, releasing a huge sigh. "It is a given, Sport, that we will all stare into the face of adversity at some point in our lives, and this for us has been our dark time. But we will get through it. I know we will," he said, biting his lips, his eyes looking sad. I got the impression my father's words were self-soothing, like calamine lotion that you put on an inflamed rash. It was as if his words were being spoken to have a tranquilizing effect on the both of us. It seemed to comfort him that he was not alone in his grief, and that everybody else faces storms in their life as well. I am not sure whether this kind of self-talk did indeed ease my father's grievous loss. It certainly did little to appease mine. My pain was personal. Did anyone really comprehend what it was like to lose a mother? I doubted many did. Not at my young, impressionable age, when I needed my mother the most. When you're at rock bottom, you look for anything to make your pain more bearable, even if it's a temporary release, like a band-aid over a cut, that while it remains fixed to the open wound, you pretend it's not there. But sooner or later, the band-aid peels away, and you are faced with the sting of your grief all over again. I think the easiest thing for me was to take each day, one step at a time, so I didn't have to reflect on the past, but focus on the present, like attending to feeding our free-range chickens, and taking a ride on my mother's horse Chloe. In a strange way, when I rode my mother's horse, I felt as if my mother was in the saddle with me. I enjoyed mucking out the stables and brushing the horses' coats until they gleamed. When my mother was alive, I had complained tirelessly about helping her with such chores. "Do I have to?" I'd complain, bunching my eyebrows together. "Yes, you do, sweetheart. It's very good to get one's hands dirty and to work hard. It's good for the soul." After my mother's untimely death, it was those kind of chores I previously rebelled about that became my quintessential lifeline to keep me grounded. I found keeping busy helped me not to focus on my feelings. I could block them out and forget they even existed. My father did much the same. He had his own mechanical workshop on our property. My father was so good with his hands and seemed to understand how to fix anything, from a broken-down toaster to an old piece of farming machinery that had not been used for centuries. People would pay him excellent money to bring back things to life and to their original pristine condition, from antiques to cars and old-fashioned children's toys, Ferris wheels, merry-go-rounds, old candy floss machines. You name it, my father could fix it. My dad's workshop was an Aladdin's cave of treasures that, when he brought back to life, looked as good as new. I'd never believed anyone could do that, but my father was a master at turning a sow's ear into a silk purse. My father fixed up things for people all over America, so his job was not just relegated to the Montana area where we lived. The farmhouse was not the same without my mother's spirited presence, her pretty laughter trilling in the house, or her tuneful voice singing one of her favourite songs. She could sing "The Hills Are Alive" with the sound of music, like Maria von Trapp. My mother owned her own guitar and was an incredible singer. Now I would never hear her pretty voice again. When she was young, before she met my father, she would sing for a local band called the Nightingales that travelled around the country. She had 5 passions: music, singing, cooking, horses, and family. We were lucky to live in an idyllic part of the world in Montana. In truth, on the outside, our farmhouse looked like a dreamy picture on a box of Swiss chocolates, especially with the sculptural mountains in the backdrop, their undulating surfaces blistered with blankets of snow. Furthermore, the rolling countryside was so often richly carpeted with a plethora of alpine wild flowers that would cover the hilltops with their breathtaking ensemble of colourful displays. And under a perfectly blue Montana sky, the views were quite literally eye candy for those who appreciate great beauty in all its forms. We'd often see great birds of prey sailing the clouds, most commonly the bald eagle, and I loved to watch those birds, as there was something so magisterial about them. My father told me that at one point in time, the bald eagle was almost extinct here in Montana, but had made an extraordinary comeback. After my mother died, a bald eagle came and rested on the banisters of our wraparound porch for several days, until my mother's funeral was over. That had never happened before or since. I always felt the eagle was carrying a message from my mother, telling us all was well. I know my mother loved bald eagles, so it made perfect sense she would use a bird of prey like this to convey a message to us. My father was a perennial cynic, but even he had to admit that our feathery visitor, after my mother's death, was more than a little idiosyncratic. Our property boasted a plethora of tall, lofty trees, and so many of them clustered together in happy groups, dappling the countryside with their viridescent resplendence. Behind our stable block on the left-hand side of the valley, where the hill flattened out, it eventually met up with a large wood grove that was so vast that I'd never actually explored the whole depth of it. It was a fabulous haven for so much indigenous wildlife. I often saw wolves on our property, coyotes, bears, and deer. Our two-story asymmetrical farmhouse, with its distinctive gable in the front of the house and large sash windows throughout, possessed an endearing rustic charm, and its wraparound porch that hugged the house overlooked the man-made silvery lake my father had created, that was surrounded by a plethora of weeping willows and abundant bird life. My father had planted those weeping willows before I was even born, and some of them had grown substantially big. On the surface, our lives looked so picture-perfect and even enviable for anyone looking at us from the outside in, and it certainly was for a long time, and would have unequivocally remained that way if my mother was still around. But without her, so much magic in our lives had been vaporized like the steam from a kettle, and me and my dad missed her terribly. I would often catch him studying photograph albums of my mother and quickly closing them when I entered the room. I think he found it easier not to talk about her, because when we did, we would feel so sad. My parents had a cherished relationship. They loved the bones of each other and could finish each other's sentences. Suffice to say, after my mother was gone, the once sumptuous, cosy living room that in previous years had been a showstopper now resembled a yard shed, rather than a comfortable place to sit by the fire after a hard day's work. At one time every room in our house had been well appointed and sparkled like a brand new pin, with gleaming furniture, perfectly polished, fresh vases of flowers strewn around the place elegantly, bright colourful scatter cushions on our settees to lend a splash of vibrancy to everything. I regret to say that these days there was dust over every hard surface, that in some places was so bad I'd been able to write my name on the old bookshelf in the entrance hall, for example, and the grandfather clock looked very sorry for itself and was always an hour and a half ahead in time, as if it too had rebelled against my mother's untimely demise. There were silken webs on the ceilings, where spiders had been able to make homes for themselves without the interfering intrusion of my mother's long feather duster, and instead of a bowl of fruit on the living room table, there was a box of termite killer, a reel of wire, a hammer, a box of nails, some packets of seedlings from leeks to cabbages to celery, and a huge pile of old newspapers. Gone was the wistfully nostalgic scent of lavender wood polish mixed in with the sweet bouquet of fresh flowers, and the smell of freshly baked cinnamon buns my mother made every Sunday morning without fail. Those were no more. These days there were jackets strewn haphazardly over the couches, and most of my mother's scatter cushions were flung to the floor like water lilies across a pond. If my mother could see the sorry state of things now, I imagine she'd be turning in her grave. I had visions of her staring at us through the clouds with a microscopic lens, and doing flip-flops over the clouds to express her frustration, for she would have loathed to see us living in such a chaotic mess, which she would have unequivocally described as pandemonium and nothing less. Our cat Sullivan, a ginger and white marmalade, with big wide green eyes, stared with bemusement at the chaos around him. He was having to perch on a pile of newspapers on the chair, as his special place had been confiscated by my father's mess. He was not best pleased by the rapid decline in living standards, and the broiled chicken my mother used to make him daily had been replaced with tin stuff, which he had turned his nose up to for a long while, until hunger had got the better of him, and he realized that he better eat the tin stuff or he might have to go hungry. My mother had died 2 years prior, from a nasty fall from her beloved horse Chloe. My father believed that Chloe got spooked by something, and came running back to our farm, with her saddled back unoccupied, and my mother nowhere to be seen. My father at once knew something was terribly wrong, and the flustered horse seemed quite disquieted. If she could speak, she would tell us what had happened. My father had rushed out on his ATV to see if he could find the whereabouts of my mother, and there she was, lying on the earthen trail, completely lifeless. The coroner said she had bashed her head so hard on the ground and had died instantly. I suppose that was a relief. At least she didn't suffer. The news hit our family hard, and in our small rural American town there was not a dry eye in the church, as my mother had been loved by the community and had often been the lead singer in the church choir. My father had not taken her death well, so his sister Liz had moved into our farmhouse for the first year to help him get back on his feet again. In truth, she had been a lifesaver to our lives, buttressing me and my father up with her encouraging words. She had taken care of us with fabulous meals and been a listening ear for us when we needed to talk. My father would never have shared his grief with anyone, but he could confide in his sister Liz. They were incredibly close. Liz had tirelessly told my father that my mother would not want him to be alone forever, and that was true. My mother's dog Pluto, who had been attached to my mother when she was alive, had now decided to adopt Liz as her new owner. She liked females. She had been a rescue from a shelter whom had been abused by a man. So when Liz moved out of our farmhouse and returned to her cottage close to the town, Pluto, the border collie mix, went with her. So once they were both gone, the farmhouse had become an incredibly lonely place. There were times I would walk into the house and hear nothing at all, and the silence was deafening. So on this day, when my father had invited a guest for dinner, he was bustling around the kitchen. I noticed there was a spring in his step, and he was whistling happily to himself under his breath. The radio was blaring in the background. I was about 10 at the time, but I sensed something very different about my father's demeanour, as if the heavy cloud of despair that had hung around his life for so long, like a suffocating dog's choker chain, had finally been lifted. The last time he was in a remarkably good mood like this was when my mother was alive. I should have put 2 and 2 together and read between the lines, but perception was not exactly my strong point. I was glad to see my father happy like this, but I thought he was finally coming to terms with my mother's death. Our trauma counsellor had told us that we would soon emerge from the black fog like a phoenix from the ashes. Was this what was happening to my dad? I wished some of the golden magic that had touched him would rub off on me, because although I was a resilient kid, my mother's death was not easy to overcome, and it still got me down a great deal of the time. I watched him with an inquisitive curiosity as he peeled potatoes vigorously, soaking them in salted water, and pounding 3 steaks with a mortar. My father was a little out of his depth in the kitchen. There was flour all over his apron. He was wearing an apron that had once belonged to my mother. Sweat seemed to be trickling down his brow, which he wiped away with the back of his hand, as he followed my mother's old recipe book, with step-by-step precision. I remember thinking he looked a little frantic, rather flustered, like a pigeon narrowly escaping a run-in with the household tabby. My father kept looking nervously at the kitchen clock on the wall, and running around the kitchen like a headless chicken, barely stopping to draw breath. The smells from the kitchen were lovely, but my father let out a huge moan when he discovered the cake he had made had flopped. For a first attempt it wasn't bad. It smelt amazing, but it was crisp at the edges and very flat in the middle, like a large vanilla cookie. He quickly prized his cell phone out of his pocket to phone his sister Liz. The expression on his face was one of total exasperation.
"Hi, Liz. It's me, Russell. No, it's a disaster. Everything has gone wrong. The recipe is disastrous." His voice wailed down the phone. "The cake has flopped. It didn't even bother to rise. It turned into a crisp vanilla cookie. It tastes nice, but it's not a cake. I wanted everything to be perfect tonight."
My father had the phone on speaker, so I heard the whole conversation he was having with Liz. "Calm down, Russell, will you? Honestly, you're acting like it's the end of the world. I'm sure you could break the cake up, cover it with custard and jam. The woman won't know any better. Throw in some strawberries. It'll be just fine. Put it into little dessert glasses. Cover it with whipped cream. It'll turn out to be a trifle. I'm sure it'll be delicious, Russell. Some of the biggest cock-ups have become sensational recipes, you know, like that Eton mess, when someone accidentally crunched up meringues with cream and fruit. It's now a popular dessert, but it was born about by a mistake, you know."
but I followed every step of the recipe. Why did the cake not rise?" said my father obsequiously.
"Well, a cake won't rise if you don't put any raising agents in it, like baking powder or self-raising flour. Did you use that? What did the recipe ask you for?" My father groaned as he looked at the recipe book.
"You're right, Liz. I put in flour instead of self-raising flour. How could I be so stupid? I didn't actually know there was a difference. How was I expected to know something like that?"
"Don't deride yourself, Russell. This is your first attempt at baking a cake. I think you've done remarkably well in the circumstances. I need to remind you that now that you've finished preparing the food, you should lay that table nicely. And then you need to clean up that living room of yours. Dust the furniture really well. Remove all the newspapers and stuff that are littering up the place. You know, since I left, I don't mean to speak unkindly, but your place looks like a bomb's hit it. If you want to impress this lady, you need to clean it up nicely and lay the table with some fresh flowers in the centre, and a couple of candles wouldn't hurt either. Would you like me to come over and lend a hand? I don't mind."
"That won't be necessary, Liz, but thanks all the same. I think I will turn the cake into a trifle like you suggested. I simply can't go through the trouble of making another cake. I'll be tearing my hair out if I go through that mayhem again."
"I'm sure it'll be delicious, Russell, and good luck, although I doubt you need it. If that woman can't see what a treasure you are, she needs her head examining, that's for sure."
"Thanks, Liz,"
said my father, ending the call, looking decidedly more optimistic.
"Sport,"
he said, looking at me brightly.
"Do you fancy giving me a hand getting this place to look halfway decent? How about dusting some of those cobwebs away from the ceiling?"
I nodded and got to work, helping my father polish furniture, throwing out old newspapers. I was surprised by the transformation of our home. It almost looked like old times, and the smells coming from the kitchen were absolutely delicious, and my stomach was churning. My father had turned his disastrous dessert into a delicious-looking trifle, and the biscuit texture of the cake was absolutely amazing. He had given me a bowl to get my approval.
"So what do you think, sport? And don't lie to me to make me feel better. There's still time to go to town and pick up a pecan nut pie if needs must."
I tasted my father's custard with strawberries, jam and biscuit-textured cake, and it was delicious. "I'm not lying, Dad, but this is amazing. Much better than pecan nut pie any day of the week." My father sighed with relief.
"I never knew how tough it was to cook," he said.
I smiled at this, coming from a man who could turn trash into treasure. It was more than a little amusing for me. That evening my father had dressed immaculately, wearing a navy blue turtleneck top and a smart pair of cream-coloured chinos. My father was a good-looking man, with dark hair that had turned silver after my mother died, but the hair looked good on him. My Auntie Liz called him a silver fox. When we heard the sound of a car rolling up our driveway, my father looked decidedly nervous. He then turned to me and said,
"Sport, I want you to be very nice to Mildred Donahue. I want you to make her feel very welcome in our home. Can you do that for me? It would make me very happy."
"Of course, Dad," I said. I must have been dopey for a 10-year-old kid. I still hadn't figured out why my father wanted to impress Mildred Donahue so much. How could I have been such a complete idiot? It was so obvious why my dad had invited this woman around. I soon understood the sober, discomposing truth when my father asked Mildred into our house, and they clandestinely exchanged knowing looks that suggested there was an intimacy between them. Worse still, I could tell at once that Mildred was quite taken by my father, and was swooning over him like a vulture over a dead carcass, and she was not subtle about her obvious infatuation towards him. It made me want to be violently sick. They both knew each other much better than I imagined. When Liz had come to the house to babysit me, when my father was conveniently indisposed, she told me that Dad needed to work late into the night in his workshop, and that had been a masterful ruse, to keep me off the scent, I suspect, as to what was really going on.
Was my father all the time rarely out and about, painting the town red with this woman Mildred Donahue? I suspected that this was the case. I may have been 10, but I wasn't a complete idiot. I could tell at once that my father liked Mildred in a romantic way, as when she flirted with him coquettishly, his eyes twinkled in response with delight. My blood ran cold, my back stiffened, as I realized in this horrifying moment that maybe my father was intending to replace my late mother with this mousy-looking woman. What did he even see in her? From the get-go I'd noticed something very insidious about her, but then I suppose I would automatically see her as the enemy, even if she had been a perfect angel, which she certainly was not. I felt an anger shoot through me like a firework on the 4th of July, but I did my level best to keep my emotions in check. I saw my father's obvious friendship with Mildred as an absolute betrayal to my mother's memory. My mother had been a vibrant personality in life, but Mildred was as dowdy as a pair of antique, mismatched tan-coloured socks lying in my father's drawer, littered with holes. There was nothing remotely special about her, and when she smiled at me, her smile was not genuine, and didn't even meet her cold, dark eyes that I could sense were calculating and mean. The worst part of it all was the moment that Mildred laid eyes on me. I could see she despised me already. "Oh, so this is your son Kurt, is it?" she said to my dad, with a large fake smile on her face that I did not buy for a single second. "It's so nice to meet you, Kurt. Your father's told me all about you. And don't worry, it's all good stuff. So tell me, young man, how old are you?" "I'm 10, I said stiffly. I didn't like anything about this woman at all, and when she looked at me, her eyes were predatory, not kind. "You're 10, are you? Oh, what a lovely age. Well, I suppose you can have your whole life ahead of you when you're that young. But of course you don't know very much at your age. You've got a lot of growing up to do still. But still, it's a lovely age, isn't it? 10. I can't remember what I was like when I was 10. I remember the dinner had been a painful, laborious affair. I say that because my besotted father could not keep his eyes off Mildred. I mean, was he as blind as a bat? It was as if he thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Could he not see that she had a pointed beak-like nose, like a bald eagle, which looks good on a bird of prey, I will admit, but not on a lady? Could he not see how treacherously cold and vindictively spiteful she was? Everything about her was far from pretty. Her hands were big like a man's, even though she had those fancy nails you get from hours spent at the nail salon. They didn't hide how masculine her hands were. My mother never had nails like that. They'd have stopped her from efficiently doing her jobs around the house and from playing the guitar. I couldn't imagine Mildred being very industrious. She looked like the kind of lazy woman who enjoyed being waited on hand and foot. My father seemed happy to oblige her every request. It was pathetic. If love turned you into a useless bowl of jello, I wanted no part of it when I got older. This woman didn't come close to my mother. What on earth did my dad see in her? The meal was a success as far as my dad was concerned, and to give my father his due, the food was delicious, although if I'm being entirely picky, the potatoes were not as crisp as my mother's would have been. But the dessert was a rip-roaring success. "This trifle, Russell, it is quite the most delicious trifle I have ever tasted. The cake is so crisp. You've got to give me this recipe." My father gave me a wink, and we both smiled, remembering the disaster in the kitchen earlier on in the day with the flat cake. It wasn't such a disaster after all. It was shortly after this dinner that my life began to change exponentially, as Mildred weaved her way masterfully into our lives. And before I knew it, my father was married to the witch, and my life was never the same after that, after she had bamboozled her way into our lives, taking charge and ensuring that my father was completely wrapped up under her spell.
and it would seem he was. My father falsely believed the sun shone out of Mildred's backside. He was obliviously unaware that there was a dark, insidious, vindictive side to her character. My dad had no idea how badly Mildred treated me. Even if I had told him as much, he'd never have believed my account. For in his dewy eyes, Mildred was as sweet as honey. The duplicitous woman turned on the charm when he was around, and was sweet to me in front of him, inquiring after my day, and asking if I wanted another scoop of ice cream. When my father wasn't there, she'd tear me apart like a bird of prey, without any remorse whatsoever, so that I lived in fear of that woman every day of my life, from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to bed at night. Mildred made no secret of the fact that she loathed me. What a pity you weren't a girl, Kurt, she complained capriciously. I can't stand little boys. When your father told me that you were a boy, oh my word, I was so bitterly disappointed. But when I met you, things were so much worse than I could have ever envisaged. It's a pity your father came with baggage at all. You're not a chip of the old block, are you? My bet is you take after your dreadful mother, and what an awful woman she was. My mother was not dreadful. She was much nicer than you, prettier too. You're ugly and plain, I told her. How dare you, Kurt? Go to your room now. I don't want to hear another word out of your poisonous mouth. Of course you think your mother was great. You're her progeny after all. And don't I know it, she said contemptuously. When my father was not around, she treated me like the turd on her shoe. I was very intimidated by Mildred. She scared me. The woman was capable of anything. She didn't like our marmalade cat Sullivan. I caught her slipping rat poison in Sullivan's food once. I clandestinely threw the contaminated food away and sneakily replaced the rat poison with icing sugar, and Mildred eventually gave up trying to kill the cat after she couldn't understand why the rat poison wasn't working, as Sullivan simply refused to die. Furthermore, Sullivan didn't want to touch the sweet food that he was presented, so I fed him discreetly behind her back, and Sullivan never ever took anything from her again, and viewed her with a great deal of suspicion. I can't stand your cat, she barked at me. Dreadful creature! Can't see what people see in them, I really can't. They should all be slaughtered and turned into scarves. I wish that bloody cat would die. I knew she wasn't a good person to hate animals so much. She even complained about the indigenous wildlife that visited our property, and saw no beauty in the bald eagles that sailed in the skies above our heads. Thankfully she liked my father's horse, and Chloe, my mother's horse, was her absolute favourite. I knew Mildred did not only wish the cat was dead, but she would have liked me out of the way as well, so that she could have my father all to herself. If she could have put drain fluid in my Kool-Aid, she probably would have done so, but Mildred was not stupid. She'd never do anything that might jeopardize her relationship with my father. One day, when it was very hot, with scorching, unforgiving temperatures due to an unmerciful heat wave, Mildred told me we were going to the shops and that I was to come with her. The air conditioning in the car was thankfully on at full blast, so it wasn't an altogether unpleasant trip to the store. If I behaved myself, maybe I could ask Mildred to buy me an ice cream. Mildred could sometimes be nice, but those moments were very rare. Everyone was wearing shorts and T-shirts, fanning themselves vigorously and complaining bitterly about the insufferable weather. When Mildred had parked her car in the parking bay at the store, I was expecting to come in with her, as it would be ridiculous for me to stay in the car in this blistering cruel weather. Instead, Mildred locked me in the car, telling me she'd be only a few minutes. I won't be long. I don't need you tagging along, slowing me down, Kurt, so you need to wait in there. But it's hot in the car. Shut your mouth, young man, and do as I tell you. I knew better than to argue with Mildred, as there was no telling what she would do to me if I continued to challenge her, so I did what she said, and obediently remained in the car. I felt like I was an egg being thrown on a frying pan that was beginning to cook. Once the air conditioning was switched off, the car became a sauna.
Let's just say every minute was insufferable as the soaring temperatures got hotter and hotter and hotter. In the beginning it was tolerable, but as the heat escalated, I found myself struggling to breathe, as if the breath in my lungs was being stolen from me, as if I was drowning. I was consuming much less oxygen because of the heat molecules that were dispersing in the air, which invariably causes you to suffocate. This is how people die in hot cars. I should have bashed the car window and crawled out, because every locked window in the car was tightly shut. But I was terrified of what Mildred would do to me. She had a waspish tongue. She'd likely tell my father that I'd bashed the window out of spite, and that would make my father angry. Mildred could be very persuasive if needs must. I knew the consequences of climbing out of this car would be bad. Mildred was taking her time. Why was she being so long? If she took any longer in the stall, I would pass out from the heat. I knew I would. I could feel sweat pouring down the back of my legs, trickling down my back and face. And then I began to shut my eyes. I could feel myself almost floating away. I was jolted awake with a woman ramming on my window. "Are you all right, young man? Are you all right? Are you all right?" She looked alarmed. At that moment, Mildred came out of the stall, carrying a large grocery bag in her arms. "What are you doing?" she challenged the lady. "Get away from my car, will you? Is that your son in the car?" The woman screamed, pointing her finger accusingly at Mildred. "Your son is dying in there! He's dying! What kind of a monster are you? The temperature today is a killer, and you leave your son in a hot car? He's dying!" Mildred pushed past her and opened the car door, letting in some much-needed air, while the woman threatened to call the police. "I'm calling the police! You are sick! You are sick! Get over yourself!" said Mildred. Once she had thrown her grocery bag on the back and parked herself on the seat, she pulled down the driver's side window and glared at the woman. "Now run along, will you? You're spoiling the scenery!" The woman just gawked at Mildred, shaking her head in disgust, as if she couldn't believe anyone could be that vindictive. It was clear that no one like Mildred had ever crossed her path before. The cool waves of the air-conditioning system brought me back to life as Mildred pressed her foot on the gas and drove away. I knew in that moment I had come a hair's breadth away from dying that day. My father was out of town for a few days on business. This was the quintessential time when Mildred could unleash her wrath on me, as my father would not be eyewitness to her duplicitous brutality. I am quite sure Mildred enjoyed punishing me. I had seen the satisfied, smug smile on her face when she delighted in inflicting discomfort on me of any kind, whether it meant sending me to bed hungry or insisting I scrub the floors so hard that my fingers finally bled. If I had ever shown her how emotionally distressed I was, she'd have been very satisfied indeed, so I always maintained a stiff upper lip and kept my emotions concealed behind a nonchalant face. The winter in Montana can be cruelly long, with heavy snow and windstorms a regular occurrence for us, and they can be brutal at times. The unforgiving, merciless temperatures can range from -2 to 50, and our national record in these parts has been 70 degrees below zero. I was so grateful to be safely indoors, with a fire crackling in the hearth. I was supposed to be doing my homework at the walnut desk, but it was so damn cold. Instead, I decided to sit close to the crackling fire by lying back on the couch to get warm. Sullivan had similar great ideas, and happily bounced onto the couch, and purring lay lackadaisically in my arms, settling down and curling up into a round ball, becoming another great source of warmth for me. Sullivan was my closest, dearest companion these days. He hated Mildred as much as I did, so he was one hell of a discerning cat. It was so cold out of doors, and had been freezing all day. I knew warming up by the fire would be a welcome relief. Once I warmed up, I told myself I would do my homework later. I knew only too well, if I was slack, Mildred would make sure I went without an evening meal in my belly. I cannot remember how many times she had punished me by denying me food. I was the thinnest boy in my class, as on many occasions I had gone to bed on an empty stomach. Unbeknown to my dad, of course,
who couldn't understand why I failed to thrive. By all accounts, he hadn't got the faintest clue what really went on behind his back, for if indeed he had known the bitter, cruel, calculating truth, the rose-coloured spectacles from which he viewed his wife through would surely melt away. I watched the flames crackling away merrily and bouncing around the wood in the hearth, spitting and popping. The sound was pleasantly reassuring to my ears. Before I knew it, my eyes grew heavy, and I drifted off into a deep, pleasing sleep. The next thing I knew was that I was being woken up violently, shaken hard. Mildred had slapped me across the cheeks, and the slap burnt my face. I looked up into her hostile eyes that were burning with rage. I touched my face as my cheeks were hurting from the impromptu slap. "You're a lazy bugger, Kurt! That's what you are! After everything that me and your father have done for you, you have the blatant audacity to fall asleep on the couch. I can't believe the nerve of it. You should be doing your homework, but instead you're lazily lying by the fire like a big fat slug. Now get your act together and off this couch at once. You know you should be studying, and if you don't want to do your homework, you can bloody well get some of the chores in the house done for me." Mildred liked me to do all the dirty work for her, so she could keep her manicured nails unblemished, the polish pristine. "I'm not here to wait on you hand and foot, young man," she said, leaning over me again, possibly to give me another slap over the face. I couldn't be sure. Sullivan bounced up and scratched her on the cheek, so very hard that blood gushed out of her wound. Mildred touched her cheek, and when she examined the blood on her fingers and the grin on my face, she became irate. I was proud that Sullivan had given Mildred a taste of her own medicine, but my smile was about to cost me big time. "You think that's funny, do you, Kurt? That your horrible cat here scratched me? I'll show you funny," she told me, grabbing me violently by the collar of my shirt and marching me up to the sliding doors of our wraparound porch. She thrust me out of the doors, virtually pushing me outside, and then she slammed them behind me and locked them shut. I could see the satisfied smirk on her face, and I knew she had no intention of letting me back into the house. She'd leave me to freeze out here. "You can stay out there, Kirk, forever as far as I'm concerned. I hope you enjoy yourself out in the cold." I began knocking on the glass pane frantically. "I'm sorry, Mildred. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to laugh," I called out. "Please let me in. Please let me in. I'm really sorry, Mildred. It's cold out here. Please don't leave me outside. Please don't. It's freezing here." "I'm not letting you in, you ungrateful little brat. I hope you freeze to death. And we'll see who's laughing then, won't we?" she said, looking at me smugly through her dead eyes. I could see the triumphant smile on her face. I knew, in that poignant moment, that the trouble I was in was deadly. My cell phone was sadly in the house. I couldn't even call anyone for help. What the hell was I going to do? That evil woman had cast me out into the cold, and in these Arctic cruel conditions, I would never survive even a few hours in this treacherous weather, where the wind howled and the cold drilled through to my bones like a jackhammer. My body temperature began to plummet rapidly. I was shaking from the cold like a leaf, and every part of me was becoming colder and colder, like a block of ice. I was wearing a sweater and a pair of chinos, along with a pair of woolly socks, but thank God I kept a pair of walking boots on the wraparound porch, as Mildred refused to allow them houseroom indoors. It was so freezing, and my fingers were numb. I could barely tie up my shoelaces, but at least I had shoes on my feet. I knew that Mildred would never let me into the house again. She was mad at me, and quite honestly, she did not care if I froze to death. On the contrary, if she came outside to find my body a lump of ice, she would delight in her discovery, and probably tell my dad a fictitious story about how I'd wandered off into the snow, got lost, and sadly frozen to death. And the worst part of it all, I was in no doubt he would believe her every word. Me and my father, who were once exceptionally close, had become increasingly distant, ever since Mildred had moved into our lives. Mildred was slowly poisoning my father's mind against me, allowing him to believe that I was an insubordinate brat, by feeding him a bunch of lies that he swallowed up hook, line and sinker. I know Mildred did this on purpose, for I'd eavesdropped on her conversation with my father on a plethora of occasions. She was like a dripping tap, slowly but surely turning my father against me. Over the last couple of years, I had seen such a disappointed look in my father's eyes, as if he really thought I had become an embarrassment to him.
I'm so sorry, Russell. There is no way to say this to you, but your son Kurt is a liability, she would complain. Oh, my word, that boy's behaviour is becoming quite unruly. I spoke to his teacher the other day, Mrs. Maddox, I think her name was. She was saying your son is bullying some of the boys at school very inappropriately. He's been most unkind to them. Really? My father had said. But Kurt is not like that. He's always been an extremely polite, sensitive boy. A lot like his mother, you know. Maybe you've got your wires crossed somewhere down the line. I don't think my Kurt would ever bully a single soul. You don't know the half of it, Russell. You don't see what he's like when your back is turned. Why, the other day he deliberately smashed a couple of our glass vases for the hell of it, just because he was in a bad mood.
I could imagine my father bunching his eyebrows together.
Well, it's been tough on him, losing his mother. Cut him some slack, will you, Mildred?
The truth was, at school I was a reticent pupil, and I'd never bullied anyone a day in my life. But Mildred could spin lies as well as a spider can create a masterful, magnificent silken web. Furthermore, it was Mildred that had broken those vases, not me. I had no clue what the time was, but I guessed it was about 4:45, as the sun was setting, brushing the snow-covered landscape with its golden hues, so that the snow glowed with an ethereal shimmer. It was perilously cold. I was shivering so much that I could barely feel my fingers and toes. They were rock hard. If I wasn't careful, frostbite was a given. Sullivan was watching me from the window. I could see his sorrowful expression. He knew I was in trouble. To keep warm, I was jumping up and down on the spot. My clothes were so pitifully pathetic, offering me little protection against the hazardous elements. I was sure, if Mildred did not open that door any time soon, I was as good as dead. I stared with a mixture of trepidation and wondrous awe at the picturesque landscape that sprawled out before me, like a never-ending expanse of white, and pondered how anything could be so beguilingly prepossessing, yet so perfidiously cold, so dangerously precarious. A wind was blowing against my skin, only making the icy damp chill that seeped through my clothes, like an unforgiving cold bath-water, all the more intolerable for me. I knew if I tried to walk to the nearest farmhouse, I'd probably be dead before I even got there. That was when I saw 3 ambiguous, dark, shadowy figures standing outside the woodgrove. A relief washed over my face, as my instincts to survive this grueling cold weather were in overdrive. I remember thinking I could get help. I didn't care how angry it would make Mildred if I sought out a stranger's help. To get me out of my grisly predicament, I was beyond caring now. I could almost sense my body was shutting down, as hypothermia was setting in. These 3 cryptic, obscure figures on the white glistening snow looked like they were wearing heavy winter coats, and I saw them as my only hope of rescue. They seemed to be running across the snow at opposite angles, but at this distance I had no idea what they were doing, nor did I actually care. I needed their help. I did not stop to ask myself who they were. I thought it might have been one of my father's employees, who helps him manage the stables. My heart lifted, and I ran through the snow towards the figures, who I didn't think had detected me, as they appeared to now be bending down in the snow, as if they were hovering over something of great interest. The 3 figures looked up at me as I ran towards them. "Help! Help!
I'm stuck in the cold. My stepmother's locked me out of the house. The words tumbled out of my mouth as I reached what I assumed was 3 men. But instead, I found myself staring into the large, human-like faces of 3 gargantuan Bigfoot. I was so astonished that for a brief moment I almost forgot my cold, although my body certainly didn't. My teeth were chattering and my whole body quivering like a blancmange jelly. I realized that the Bigfoots had been hunting, as the body lying in the snow with crimson blood seeping into the white icicles was a dead deer that they'd only just killed. Its brown eyes were glazed over like a dead fish. Its body still warm but lifeless. One of the Bigfoots, who, like the other 2, was wearing an animal skin over her hair-covered body, like a short tunic that covered her torso, discerned my body was shaking with the cold. She unhesitantly and very unselfishly tore the animal skin off her own body and wrapped it generously around me, like a large fluffy towel that is swathed around you after a warm bath. The deerskin that was tied together with leather thongs literally swallowed up my little body like a thick blanket, but I didn't mind. The body warmth of the Bigfoot was in the deer pelt, and it was wonderful. The relief and gratitude I felt was overwhelming. The Bigfoots had more compassion for me, a perfect stranger, than my stepmother. I felt the ice in my bones melt away as my body began to thaw, and I was feeling warm again, but my fingers were like hard bullets. I felt as if I couldn't feel them at all. I was surprised when the female Bigfoot, as if reading my mind, suddenly took my tiny hand into her huge one and was rubbing my fingers so vigorously that they became warm as the blood returned to my hands. Her dark eyes bored lovingly into mine, and she said, "Itolapa." Is that better? I nodded, realizing in amazement that I seemed to understand her words. I did not dwell on this quirky peculiarity. For at 12 years old, you're less questioning about enigmatic curiosities that you do not comprehend. You accept them as the natural rhythm of the moment. The Bigfoots were talking to each other earnestly in a foreign language. Matilani kadapona pa sila tua hikula mofolana shaka sakiniti. Uputa hilapagi o gilotolona tuana hasikanilo nobana finakata likwa sila tilakana po ilitaki o koloko nitakola mataki na fata. I didn't understand what they were saying, but I knew they were talking about me. The female turned around to look at me directly. She pointed to my farmhouse and said, "Ikabigulo asa duiletov." Home? Should you not be at home? You die out here in the cold. I can't go there. My stepmother has locked me out, I explained, while all 3 Bigfoots stared at me incredulously, as if my words had slapped them hard across the face, and they were trying to make sense of them. The female Bigfoot nodded. I realized she understood my every word. She glanced at the farmhouse with anger written on her face. If I didn't know any better, I guess she'd like to give Mildred a piece of her mind for treating me so despicably. The Bigfoots continued to talk quickly backwards and forwards among themselves, as if deciding what to do about me. One of them was pointing towards the south. Malina tilakota pasi na talakani kola fina so ha salakwa. Wakalikita, oko kaliki, hashana silo, o manifa kinasati la makolonita, hilaki ha makolasho. I was not afraid of them at all. Perhaps I should have been. As to look at, they were so intimidating. But for me, their humanness made them very relatable, for they possessed a very obvious emotional intelligence, and they knew it wasn't right for me to be out in the cold like this. They were going to do something to help me. I could sense that. They were enormous, built like 3 incredible hawks, covered with long, flowing dark hair that was densely thick. But despite their natural protection from the cold, they were still sporting animal pelts. The animal skin I was now covered in had taken away the icy chill like magic. I have no idea how tall the Bigfoots were. I am often asked that question. I think they were between 7 and 9 foot tall. and their faces were remarkably human. The female Bigfoots had tiny breasts. There were 2 of them and 1 male. I could tell the sexes based on their voices, and of course the fact that the male was so enormous, and his voice boomed like a heavy drum, and when he spoke, he was very commanding as they talked. Agila nakwa sila tila kila fo. I noticed their gestures were effusively dramatic. They used their hands a lot, as well as facial expressions. The female Bigfoot suddenly tapped me on the shoulders to get my undivided attention. Hilitaki ho patilasa. We talk about how to help you. Dagilatila fonapasi fogosha. I take you to nice people. She pointed towards the south. Dilafotakila mokosa. I would take you with us, but it is best you be with your own kind. The male Bigfoot said some words to me. Dila Nicolasi lasso. Go well with you, son. He tapped me on the shoulder. Then he flung the dead deer over his shoulders, and the 2 Bigfoots glided away, leaving me with the female Bigfoot who had given me her deer pelt to wear. I liked her so much. Kilatilana ankika, she told me. Kilatilako asa. My name is Ankika. It means the fire will not die out. Dilanotolasi, I'll keep you safe. The Bigfoot lowered her body so I could climb on her shoulders, with both legs resting on either side of her chest, and then she jumped up on her feet nimbly and ran through the snow with the grace and speed of a cheetah. The whole world was like a magnificent winter wonderland, spectacularly transfixing. The golden glaze of the sunset had faded away as the night reclaimed its charge over the day. The darkening sky had gobbled up all the light without apology. But this was of no hindrance or deterrent to this female Bigfoot. I perceived she had night vision, as her eyes in the darkness became like yellow traffic lights. I could not see much beyond the stars and the pearly luminescence of the moon that cast down her silvery shadows across the snow in an ethereal silvery glaze. I could feel the rise and fall of the Bigfoot's chest as she breathed and glided with me on her shoulders. I was warmly wrapped up in the animal pelt, and it seemed so surreal to be riding on the back of a Bigfoot. Finally I could see lights in the snow as we moved towards them, and then I realized it was a farmhouse. That was when the Bigfoot put me down very gently on the ground so that I would not slip. Kilanikasi, hotola fita. Go to the door and knock, she told me. Tilanatsi katola. I'll wait to see you get in fine. Loni sa vugoto. They are good people, she told me. Dilanikasi. I've seen their energy before. La tilapo. I know they will help you. Go sinasi. Go well. Thank you so much, I said to the Bigfoot, and gave her a warm hug. And then I ran towards the small farmhouse. I banged on the door, and an old man ushered me into the house. I could see the very bewildered look on his crinkly face, but he gave me an encouraging warm smile, and unhesitantly invited me into his home. "What are you doing out there, young man, in the cold?" he asked me. "You're very young. Should you not be at home with your parents? Are you lost?" I thought better than to tell him about the Bigfoot. I knew how sceptical adults could be. "My stepmother threw me out of the house," I told him. "She was cross 'cause I didn't do my homework and the cat scratched her cheeks. She told me she hoped I died in the snow. I was so cold, so I came here for help." "Mabel," called the man. "Mabel, come here, will you?" I guessed he was calling his wife. "There's a young man here." "How old are you, son?" he asked me. 12, I said. "He's 12, Mabel," said the man, calling out after his wife. Mabel was a cheerfully round and buxom woman that you couldn't help but like immediately. She came bustling out of the kitchen. She was wearing an apron tied around her ample middle, and there was an amazing cheesy smell that filtered throughout the house that made my stomach growl with hunger. It was such an amazing smell, and I realized how famished I was. I couldn't remember when I'd last eaten. Did I hear right, young man? She asked me. Did you say that your stepmother threw you out of the house in this freezing cold weather? I nodded. What is wrong with her? Asked Mabel, looking aghast. Is she completely out of her mind? What did your father have to say about this? She asked. Surely he was not all right about you being thrown out of doors in weather like this. You wouldn't even do that to a dog. He doesn't know. He's away on business. When he's not looking, my stepmother is horrible to me. My dad thinks she's nice, but she's mean to me all the time. I think she wants me to die of the cold. She sounds utterly appalling, said the old lady, wrinkling her pert little nose up in disgust and staring at me pitifully through her kind blue eyes. Where do you live, young man? I live at the Stevensons' property. My dad's called Russell Stevenson. Oh, my word, you're Russell Stevenson's son. What a small world this is. I'm so sorry about what happened to your mother dying in that horse-riding accident a couple of years back. I understand your poor father got married again. Is this the stepmother you're talking about? Is she the one that threw you out of your house? I nodded. I didn't like her. Well, I don't like her, I said, tears spilling down my cheeks. I'm sorry, I blubbered. I was scared out there, really scared. I thought I would die. It was so cold I couldn't even feel my fingers. I thought I was going to die. Mabel looked angry. Her turkey-like jowls jiggled with indignation. She growled under her breath. Some people don't deserve to breathe the same air as we do. That stepmother of yours wants locking up and the key throwing away. Who in their right mind treats a child like this? It's outrageous, she said, shaking her head furiously. Outrageous! It's child cruelty, that's what it is. Mabel's eyes travelled over my body, and she observed the large animal pelt wrapped around me. Where did you get that from, son? She asked me. I found it on a tree, I lied. It seemed easier to tell her a porky than my Bigfoot account. I didn't want her to think I wasn't credible. My story would sound so far-fetched and spurious. If I heard it, I wouldn't believe it either. Even at 12 years old, I had a wise head on my shoulders. I had become quick-witted over the last couple of years to survive my treacherous stepmother. Good job you did, son. Very clever of you to find it. It may well have saved your life. Now come with me and get warm by the fire, and I'll make you something very nice to eat. Do you like macaroni and cheese and gammon ham? Yes, I love macaroni cheese, I said, touching my stomach. I'm very hungry. I haven't eaten a thing. There's nothing on you, young man. Does that stepmother of yours feed you, or are you naturally skinny? Sometimes she sends me to bed without food. Does your father know about this, young man? I shook my head. No, I won't tell him because Mildred, well, she might hurt me. The old couple watched me eat my food on a tray next to the fireplace, with their dog Snickerdoodle, a big bulldog, lying at my feet. I had always loved bulldogs, and Snickerdoodle was an amazing foot-warmer. Look, son, said Mabel, do you happen to know your father's cell phone number? I think I need to talk to him. It's about time he listened to some home truths. Your stepmother is called Mildew, is that right? Mildew is green stuff, I told her. It's stuff that grows on the side of a swimming pool. My stepmother is called Mildred, not Mildrew. Well, she's as slimy as Mildrew, isn't she? Said Mabel, making me smile. I've heard rumours about that woman in town, I'll have you know. Someone saw her in church recently, stuffing some of the notes from the collection plate into her purse. I was so sure the story was fictitious. Now I'm not so sure. It sounds like your stepmother is capable of almost anything. I've met your father before, Russell. Such a nice man he is. I'm surprised he hasn't seen through your stepmother. But I guess that's love for you. It can be blind, can't it? Sometimes we see what we want to see, and not the truth. I nonchalantly gave Maple the cell phone number of my father, and I could hear her speaking to him in the next room as I ate my meal. I could tell Mabel's voice was slightly raised. I think she was angry with what Mildred had done to me. Yes, Mr. Stevenson, it's Maple Warrington speaking here. Remember you fixed up my old 1950s bicycle once? You did a great job, I have to tell you. Good as new. I came to visit you at your workshop, don't you remember? My farmhouse is not too far from yours by car. I live at Whistler's Mead farmhouse. You remember the one? The stone building? Yes, that's right. I do remember. I met your wife at the time. Lovely woman. I just need to tell you I have your son here with me, Kurt. He was thrown out of your farmhouse at sunset this afternoon by his stepmother, Mildred. I'm sorry, Mr. Stevenson, but I don't know what kind of vile human being would throw their stepson out into the cold like this. Do you have any idea how freezing it is out there? The temperatures are insane. Your son is very lucky to be alive, Mr. Stevenson. I'm sorry my voice is raised, but this is cruelty, the likes of such I've never seen before. Your son is 12 years old, for God's sake. Yes, it is outrageous, isn't it? My thoughts exactly. I understand from your son that his stepmother Mildred is always mean to him like this. Have you ever wondered why he's so thin? I gather she denies him meals sometimes. It's outrageous. And she threw him out at sunset because he didn't do his homework, and the cat scratched her. I'll tell you this for nothing, Mr. Stevenson, and I hope you don't mind my speaking out of term here. But you need to take a long, hard look at that woman you've married. Your late wife would never have treated her son like this, nor any other decent human being, for that matter, that possesses an ounce of decent compassion. All I can say, Mr. Stevenson, is you're incredibly lucky. Your son managed to find his way to our property. I don't know how he did, but he did, and thank God. You might be returning home to his corpse. And I don't say that lightly, Mr. Stevenson. No, he's very welcome to stay here. Good. We'll see you in the morning then. Maple entered the living room, where I continued to toast my feet by the fire, next to Snickerdoodle. When you're ready, Kurt, you can have a nice warm bath and then go up to bed. I've prepared a bed for you. Your dad will be here in the morning to pick you up. He is mortified your stepmother threw you out. He told me it will never ever happen again. He said to say he was so sorry about everything, and to let you know he loves you very much. My eyes glistened with tears. It was a long time since my father had told me he loved me. The next morning I woke up to the yummy smell of bacon and eggs filtering through the atmosphere. I discovered I was lying in a stranger's very pretty bedroom, and then I remembered the previous night and my extraordinary encounter with 3 Bigfoot, who had unquestionably saved my life. I knew in my heart I would always feel indebted to them, and when I thought of the female Bigfoot, a smile burst out onto my face. I knew I could never forget her kindness. The bed was so much more comfortable than my bed at home, as Mildred had replaced my bed with the old bed in the garage with broken springs and a hard mattress that my parents had intended to throw away a long time ago. I could hear a loud snoring, and discovered that Snickerdoodle was lying by my bed, with her pink tongue sticking out, which made me smile. She opened her eyes and followed my gaze as I climbed out of bed. I was wearing Mabel's grandchild's pyjamas, which she kept for her grandson when he came to stay with her from time to time. It turned out he was the same age and size as I was, which was a stroke of luck. I trotted down the stairs with Snickerdoodle behind me, guided towards the smell of bacon. Mabel was bustling around her range oven and gave me a big beam when I entered the kitchen. "Did you have a good night's sleep, Kurt? I hope you did." "Yes, thanks." "Would you like some bacon and eggs? They've just been cooked. I thought you might be hungry." "I would like that very much, Mrs." "It's Mabel. Call me Mabel," said the old woman. "Even my grandchildren call me Mabel. I told them that the word granny makes me feel very old." "But you are old," I said. "That's exactly why I don't need to be reminded of the fact," she said to me, laughing. "You're not much different to my grandkids, Kurt. They're always telling me I'm ancient." "Well, you are old, but you're very nice. I wish my stepmother was like you." "Thank you, Kurt," said Mabel. "That's very sweet of you to say. "Ah, I think your father is here," she said. "I can hear a car in the driveway." When Mabel opened the front door for my father, he asked, "Where is he?" The next thing I knew is he rushed into the kitchen and threw his arms around me. There were tears in his eyes. I'd never seen my father cry before. "Oh, my God, Sport, I'm an idiot, a complete idiot. I'm so glad you're all right. I heard what Mildred did. I don't know what to say, son. It's outrageous what she did to you." Me and my father hugged for a long time. I thought he'd never let go of me. He was so grateful that I was alive. Mabel and her husband watched us, and I could see they were tearing up. Mabel said to my father, "You need to get rid of Mildred." My father nodded. "Don't you worry, Mabel," he growled. "She's gone." When me and my father arrived at the house, my father, holding my hand, marched into the house with fury written on his face. I'd never seen him so angry before. "Oh, there you are, darling," said Mildred, rushing towards my dad. But she stopped dead in her tracks when she saw my father was holding my hand in his. "What do you mean, Mildred, by throwing my son out into the cold last night? He could have died. What kind of a monster are you?" "Oh, honestly, Russell, listen to yourself. You know that Kurt is a liar. I did no such thing. Do you think I'd throw a 12-year-old boy out into the snow? You know I'm not like that, Russell." "Get out, Mildred. Get out of my house now. And I don't care where you go, but I never want to lay eyes on you again. You'll be hearing from my lawyer any day now." "But Russell, your son is lying to you. Don't you see he's making all these stories up about me to drive a wedge between the two of us? He's never liked me, you know, made that quite clear. He wants to break us both up. That's why he's spinning these dreadful yarns. He's treacherous, Kurt, he really is. You don't see what he's really like. You must believe me." "Out of my house, Mildred, now, or I'll call the police and you will be arrested for child cruelty. You're a sick woman, and God only knows what I ever saw in you." Mildred scurried out of our house like a frightened rabbit, and we never ever saw her again. And that was the best moment of my life. "I'm sorry, son," my father said to me, wrapping his arms around me. "I've been a dreadful fool. But from now on, things are going to be different. I shall never get married again, and you have my word for it. No one can replace your late mother. I see that now." My father lived up to his promise, and we became incredibly close. Today he remains my very best friend. But I know that if those Bigfoots had not rescued me, I would certainly not be here today. So I am forever indebted to them for their kindness, even though I have never seen sight or sound of them since. But they are forever in my heart. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, their divorce was looming like a dark storm brewing over the horizon. The thunderclouds of their rocky, tumultuous relationship had finally gathered together. They were getting heavier and heavier and heavier, until finally they burst open. The rain pelted down, splashing against the windows with hundreds of tears that dribbled down the glass. They were the tears of what could have been, the endless possibilities, the hopes and the dreams of a future that ultimately would never be fulfilled. There came a point in a marital relationship when finally both parties had to call it quits. That was the case between both my parents, as these days there was no love lost between them. It tore me and my sister apart to hear the two people we loved most in the entire world pulling each other's hair out like this. They didn't realise how much easier it would have been for us if they'd split up a long time ago. They falsely assumed that staying with us is exactly what we wanted. My brother and I would pray that they would leave each other. We longed for peace and quiet in our lives more than anything else in the entire world. We wanted to have the quintessential happy, predictable life, doing routine, standard, customary things in a convivial atmosphere, like most normal families did. How we wanted to be ordinary, for we would have happily settled for boring, tediously dull days doing mundane things. That would have been like sweet music to our ears, for predictable and calm, our lives were certainly not. You could liken our home to a fragile, unstable boat sailing on a stormy sea, being thrust, blasted around violently by gale-force blustering winds, blowing across the ocean to the left, to the right, made worse by the undercurrent of the choppy, tumultuous high waves, crashing, pounding, battering, and knocking against its hull. That boat is going to be in pretty poor shape after so much upheaval, which was much like the dysfunctional state of our family. It was beginning to crack and fall apart. One morning it happened. I knew it would at some stage, but today was the day. I woke up to find the house unusually quiet. I could hardly believe it. I could not hear the usual sounds of my truculent, sulky mother crashing around in the kitchen, deliberately thrashing pans and crockery around in the sink in one of her pugnacious, contentious temper tantrums. Nor could I hear my father's raised voice telling my mother to shut the F up. On the contrary, the silence was golden. I felt as if I could breathe again, drink in the sweet oxygen of a perfectly beautiful day. I cautiously climbed down the sweeping ornate mahogany staircase of our very gloomy, depressing Victorian-style home that I'd never ever liked. It was such a dark, oppressive house with a heavy, irksome, pessimistic energy. It blocked out the light of the day, as the sunlight somehow failed to envelop the house, even when the windows were left wide open, when curtains were pinned against the wall. I never could understand why that light failed to filter through our home. It was wallpapered in a hideously ugly gold design against a dark burgundy background. If my mother could go back in time, she would live in the Victorian era, in a heartbeat, provided of course she was part of the gentry and could be waited on by butlers and wear some of those fabulously flamboyant outfits. I found my mother in the kitchen, seated at the dark mahogany kitchen table, her jaundiced face almost as stormy as the wood itself. Her bloodshot eyes were framed by pink rims. She was sniffing into her tissue, her pretty blue eyes clouded by tears. I noticed her slender fingers were trembling as she tried to smoke a cigarette. I'd never seen my mother smoking before. She drew in the smoke, blowing it out of her pursed lips slowly, as if the release of the wispy trail of smoke brought her a measure of comfort. In truth, I'm not even sure she inhaled, but the action of smoking calmed her nerves. "Your father, he's left us for good," she said, sniffing. We're getting a divorce." I could feel the relief welling up in my heart. Silently, inwardly, I was praising God. Peace! Peace at last, I thought. Outwardly, I tried to be rather reassuring. "It's probably a good thing, Mum," I said. "It's been a long time coming. You and Dad have been at each other's throats for ages. You haven't said a kind word to each other." My mother turned around to look at me. Her eyes seemed almost glazed like a glass marble. She seemed reflective, wistful, speculative. "He nearly killed me last night. Well, not really, but he did put his hands around my neck. He began to squeeze, but just for a second. It was only a little squeeze, as if there was a large part of him that really wanted to kill me. I've never seen him so mad. I could see the rage in his eyes." I put a comforting hand on my mother's arm to hearten her. "You know Dad isn't a violent man by nature. You know that. I know he'd never harm you. But you have been rubbing him up the wrong way recently. I just think the two of you are not meant to be together. The fact that you even suggest he put his hands around your neck proves your relationship is at that point, breaking point. It proves you're not good together anymore." "But I don't understand. What happened? We used to love each other once. We couldn't get enough of each other. How? How did it come to this? I know you're right. He would never hurt me. I know your father. But the fact that he was tempted to wring my neck shows how bad things have gotten between us, and that really disturbs me." "Well, maybe it just fizzled out. Maybe your relationship has worn its course. It happens. Life happens. Things only went pear-shaped after we bought this house. Don't you remember? Your father never liked this house. He thought it was gloomy, Platonian, depressing. I remember him saying that the house felt hostile towards him, almost as if it personally wanted to throw him to the curb. The house, I mean, not me. Well, it is gloomy, dim, sombre, and very bleak. I agree with him. I've never ever liked this house. I know you do. But sometimes it feels like it's watching you. You don't think this house has been the cause of our marital problems? My mother asked me suddenly. It wouldn't be the first time this has happened, nor the last. I've been doing some research on supernatural forces that drive people apart, like bad spirits. Maybe that's our problem. Remember when you told us you saw that strange Victorian woman in this house? Your father saw her too. Do you still see her? She asked me. I shuddered. I didn't want to remember the evil old hag that I saw sometimes in our home. I could remember the first time I'd seen her. It was shortly after we moved in to the Victorian house, the house that I simply hated to call home, as everything about this place made my skin crawl. Now that I came to think of it, I do not recall a time when anybody ever laughed or smiled in our home. Every guest who's ever visited us in this place would be so eager to leave soon after they'd shortly arrived, making up a fictitious excuse to go, most especially male visitors who always seemed rather alarmed, as if some unseen invisible force had somehow managed to threaten them. They often complained that they were experiencing a thumping headache, but the moment they left our house, it had miraculously gone. Of course, my mother, who was a sceptic at the best of times, thought it was just a storm in a teacup. I knew it wasn't. Why did my father always suffer from those anomalous headaches at home? But when he left the house, they would magically disappear. That just never made sense to me. My father had tirelessly told my mother over and over again that there was something wrong with the house, but she had refused to listen. "Don't be ridiculous," she would say. My father told her about the witch I'd been seeing in my bedroom at night, which he even had initially perceived as just a nightmare. But then he'd seen her too. He had felt her icy cold hands on his back, pushing him forcefully down the staircase. He had looked up to see who had pushed him. He had witnessed the acrimonious, mean-spirited Victorian woman that I had been seeing. She was glaring at him through a pair of hideously evil eyes. My father said he could feel her thunderous hatred towards him as physically as a blow to the head. It was a tangible experience. He could never forget the creepy, vindictive, triumphant expression upon her face. It seemed she delighted in his anguish, took pleasure in his pain, was desirous for him to suffer, really suffer. She did not want my father in her house, any more than she wanted me hanging around. That was why she had materialized before us. She wanted us to see her. She wanted to drive us away using fear as her weapon. She wanted to terrorize us. It seemed she had laid claim to the space from beyond the grave. "She wants me out of this house," he had told my mother. She is the cause of all the angst and conflict in our home. She does not like me. She doesn't like men at all. Have you not noticed how male visitors never stay at our home? Come on, Sonia, get real. You know we never used to fight like this. We never used to be at each other's throats all the time. Let's sell up, move away, have a brand new start. You know it makes sense." Had my mother listened? Not a chance. She had said, "Oh, don't be so ridiculous. There is no such thing as ghosts." She would become belligerent, unreasonable, cantankerous. Sometimes I would swear that the smile on her face was not even her own. I would wonder if the vindictive ghost in our house was influencing my mother in some way, possibly even speaking through her. For indeed there were times that I questioned whether I was actually speaking to my mother. I remember the first time I ever saw the evil hag. That was when I was lying in bed at night. I was about 13 years old at the time. I could hear the howling, blustering wind outside, rattling the half-open window of my bedroom. It was making a ghastly racket as its wooden pane was slamming, crashing violently against the outside wall, while icy cold air blasted through the room, its feisty currents undulating the curtains that were swinging backwards and forwards. I yawned, groaning as I climbed out of bed surreptitiously, walking over to the window to shut it tightly behind me. It was so freezing in my bedroom. The temperature had dropped substantially. I could see the misty vapour of my own breath before my face. This was not normal for early autumn. I hurriedly bolted towards the window, now waking up quite quickly. I fastened it tightly behind me. Then I glanced out of the window fleetingly. The dark, sultry silhouettes of the large oak trees that fringed our street caught my attention. They jiggled while falling leaves rustled, blowing across the ground like celestial butterflies. But even so, there was no subtle illumination to this night, as menacing shadows seemed to move between the trees. A heavy darkness clung to everything. You could feel it, but not fathom it at all. It seemed so incongruous to the gentle, pleasing ambience of the street I knew. That was when my eyes became fixed on what I can only describe as a rather formidable, solid black silhouette. It stood out like a sore thumb in the duskiness as a focal point. It was much, much blacker, denser and darker than anything else. I leaned against the window, my nose smudged against the glass. I tried to discern what this solid vertical mass actually was. Then it began to move. I realised it was the shape of a woman. She was blacker than the night, wearing a full Victorian dress. In a trice, the hard, angular face with the sharp features was drawn towards my window. Slowly and surely, her chin lifted upwards, her dark, soulless eyes pinning on me. They glared at me. In terror, I swiftly ran to my bed, dived under the covers to hide from what I'd seen. My heart pounding violently in my chest, my breathing laboured, my body trembling in terror. All of a sudden, the tightly fastened window blew open on its own accord. Now I ask you, how does that happen? I had secured the window extra tight. I could hear the wooden pane banging loudly against the outside wall. Now I was scared, really scared. A rush of icy wind blew through my bedroom, its howl now reduced to a baleful, moaning sound, while the curtains swung backwards and forwards, making that portentous, inauspicious clicking sound with a loud, continuous tap, 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 while the railing rattled, but something else threatening had entered the room. Not just the wind, something else. I could feel a very substantial presence. Dare I look, I thought. I knew in the gut of my being that something was there. I was so afraid of what I would see. Someone was in my room. I could hear the bustle of a fabric skirt caressing the floor. Not that hideous old bat, I thought. Please, God, no! Don't let it be her! I peeked over the covers. Then I saw her. The haunting, apocalyptic woman that I'd seen outside my window was now standing at the end of my bed, leering at me, with a menacious, ill-omened grin developing on her face that rather reminded me of a menacing clown. I could see her clearly now. Her skin was whiter than paper, her eyes dark, hostile, uncongenial. Her promenade dress tapered at the waist, spread out into a full bustle skirt. She moved towards me, getting closer, closer, and closer with every step. I screamed and screamed. Seconds later, she was just gone. My father came bolting into my bedroom. "What is it, son?" he asked. There was an evil woman in my room," I cried. "She was staring at me. She was hideously evil." "Now, son, there is no one here," my father reassured me. "You were just having a nightmare." He walked over to the window to fasten it behind him. "You shouldn't leave your window open like this, with a gusty wind blowing out there." Since that day I had seen her occasionally in our house, always with that malevolent, victorious grin on her face, as if she was triumphant about something. Sometimes when I was getting dressed for school, a dark shadow would quickly dart past me in the mirror. I would also sometimes feel eyes searing through me when I opened my closet door. Sometimes something would brush against my shoulders with a light touch that felt more like a push or a shove. Other times I'd hear the bustle of her skirt, or a faint bouquet of her flowery fragrance. "Son," my mother repeated, "can you hear me? Are you listening? Do you still see her in this house?" she demanded. "Please, I need to know." Yes, I do from time to time, I admitted. I don't always physically see her, but I can sense her, hear her, and even smell her. But why do you care now? When Dad was here, he told you that the house was problematic, that there was a ghostly woman that could potentially be the instigator of your marital problems. But you refused to listen. Isn't it a bit late in the day to be crying over spilt milk? I mean, the horse has already bolted. There's no need to be so nasty. Oh, it is this bloody house. I knew it, said my mother. Your father and I, we never used to fight like this. Fast forward to about 3 months after my father had left home. My mother told us we were going to stay with him for a while. We were to learn he was living in a trailer home in a farmer's field. He was doing odd jobs for the man in exchange for board, as well as jobs for other locals in the rural town. We were to learn that he was living in a trailer indefinitely, until he decided where it was he wanted to lay down roots. Me and my sister Jolene were aching to see my father again. We had missed him so terribly much. We were eager to see him. Once a taxi dropped us outside the trailer, we were at last reunited with him. I could see he looked absolutely exhausted, as if the past 2 years of constant bickering with my mother had worn him to a frazzle. I told my father that Mum was now considering that the Victorian house was to blame for their break-up. He looked at me in surprise. I have been telling her that for 2 whole years, but would she listen? Not a chance. She was insistent I was wrong. You know she was the one that wanted that horrid house. None of us did. What she saw in it is beyond me. Even the day we looked around the place, it haunted me. I've never liked the house, Dad, I agreed. Do you miss Mum? I asked. I don't miss the way we were in that house, son, but I missed what we were before we moved into that god-awful place. I miss all our family being together, like the good old days. My father's trailer was pretty standard, nothing special really, very mediocre, but the breathtaking countryside that surrounded it really was spectacular. It more than made up for its inadequacies. There were acres of dense woodland, flowering meadows, and undulating green fields. It felt like we were on a fabulous holiday, even though we were living far removed from the lap of luxury. A Spartan, rather simple existence with solar energy and propane gas heaters. But we didn't care. It was great to be reunited with our dad again. That's what really counted. You can explore anywhere you like, but the farmer has told me the woods behind the trailer you would do best to avoid. Why? We asked. Not sure, really. He seemed adamant that it was out of bounds somehow. I must confess that the most reckless thing my father could have done was to tell us that the woods behind us were not to be explored. It's a little like putting a juicy bone next to a naughty dog, telling him not to eat it. It's never going to work. The temptation becomes irresistible. I've always appreciated beauty in every form, but this woodgrove was out of this world. The trees were so tall, majestic, imposing, statuesque, sweeping up into the sky like graceful giants. Their full branches spread out like ballet dancers, while light twinkled through the leaves, dancing onto the forest floor, bespeckling and dappling it in an ethereal light. We were aware of the pretty sounds of the birds tweeting, accompanied by the soothing sound of a waterfall, crashing, thundering, cascading, foaming, and fizzing over the rocks, where it fell downwards into pretty pools of water below. Oh, it's so beautiful in here, said my sister, dashing eagerly towards the rock pool with a reverent enthusiasm. No wonder the farmer doesn't want anyone around here. This place is the quintessential day spa. Have you ever seen anything so lovely? We both eagerly threw off our socks and shoes and went paddling in the water. It was deliciously cool. The exuberant spray from the waterfall created a feisty current, which was very invigorating as it jetted against our legs, while its misty spray splashed our faces with droplets of water. We were in heaven. Then we stopped dead in our tracks, for we could see a large black bear sitting in the water, its powerful back facing away from us. He possibly hadn't heard us, as the fast pace of the waterfall drowned out all the noise. Such a sight made the hackles on the back of my neck stand on edge, as I knew that you never wanted to surprise a black bear, as it could potentially become quite aggressive. An angry bear is a dangerous creature indeed, with a capacity to kill if it feels threatened. My sister was pointing to the bear, trying to use sign language to get us to leave the water immediately, but it was too late. The creature had seen us. I could see its head swivelling around to look directly at us. But this was not a bear. What was it? The creature looked as if it was part ape and part human. I was so stunned by what I was observing that my jaw dropped open in astonishment, my eyes growing as round as saucers, my body trembling in dismay. Whatever this creature was, it was far more intimidating than a bear. The next thing I knew was that the creature rose up on its back haunches, in the water. He stood up, shaking the excess water out of his hair, rather like a shaggy dog. He towered at about 8 foot tall, was all hair, solid brawn, powerful muscle. When it stood up on its 2 legs, it positively made a black bear look like a kid's fluffy toy. The eyes on this creature terrified the living daylights out of me. I could see the anger, indignation, and aggression igniting in those deep-set eyes. The creature began to snarl at us. It then ground its teeth together, pulling back its lips to reveal its oversized human teeth. Then it unleashed the most terrifying growl that caused the forest to shudder, let alone me. I was standing there in the water. My sister was screaming my name, but I failed to hear her, as her voice seemed like a faint murmur in the distance, like a radio from miles away. My eyes were drawn deeper and deeper into his gaze, like a magnetic hold that locked me in his stare, that I could not release myself from, almost as if I'd been handcuffed to a chair. I tried to look away from his gaze, but I couldn't break the spell that was holding me prisoner. Jolene bravely lunged towards me. She grabbed my hands violently, pulling me as hard as she could away from the water. "What the heck is wrong with you?" she spouted. "For goodness sake, run!" I was suddenly shaken out of that hypnotic stupor. I began to run. My sister was hot on my trail. I felt like a deer being pursued by a savage lion. I know exactly what it feels like to be hunted, to be at the mercy of another wild animal that actually has no mercy. I felt powerless against this mighty beast. I could hear my heart thundering in my ears, the fast pace of my breathing, along with the desperate voice in my head that kept telling me to run for my life. Every time the creature's padded foot hit the ground, it was like it thundered. Boom, 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 as the feet got ever closer towards me. I was sure that in any second it would grab me. Tears began to stream down my cheeks, but finally hope gleamed on the horizon like a colourful rainbow, offering some promise. My sister and I exited the forest. We went running through the open meadow towards the trailer. We dashed inside the trailer, slamming the door behind us as fast and as quickly as we could. But the creature never followed us. We glanced out of the trailer window. Looking towards the forest, we could see him retreating back into the woods from whence he came. We never told my father what we'd seen, but we declined any opportunity to go into those woods again. We were to find out later that we had encountered a Bigfoot. One day my father announced that he was seeing a very special lady who was to become our new stepmother. We were going to meet her at a restaurant in Charleston the following day. "I want you to be very nice to her," he told us. "Be on your best behaviour." "But Dad, you've only recently ended it with Mum. Isn't it too soon to go gallivanting into another relationship?" I said. "It's never too soon to have a fresh start," said my father, giving me a grin. "Don't you worry. I'm sure you're going to like her." I felt very resentful that my father was seeing someone new. How could he? It was hard to digest this appalling revelation. It was like ingesting something seriously sour, unpalatable, repugnant. I felt like I was going to be violently sick, hurl all over the place. Now it all made sense to me. Over the last 3 weeks, while we had stayed in his trailer home, my father had been behaving rather strangely. He'd been humming to himself in the morning when he was shaving, singing to himself in the shower, disappearing furtively behind the trailer to talk to someone on his cell phone. And furthermore, during the late evenings, he would usually be gone for a couple of hours, always making some kind of lame excuse to us. I had known he'd been up to something, but having an affair while we were staying in his trailer, I mean, how low could he get? It was disgusting. "I'm not going to like her," I told my sister. "I know I'm not." "Well, try to be nice to her," said Jolene. "I mean, you want Daddy to be happy, don't you?" I mumbled. The truth was, despite the chaos and pandemonium in our previous home, I couldn't envisage my father with another woman. The attentive young waitress invited us to sit at a rather grandiose-looking table that we had booked, at an ornate-looking stylish restaurant in Charleston, credited with having the most phenomenal chefs. It seemed my father was going overboard to impress this lady of his. Again, I could feel the resentment rising up in the back of my throat. I was far from happy. I knew I was going to be waspish towards her. I wouldn't be able to help myself from sticking the knife in. I already despised her and disliked her. We were seated on the lavish upholstered chairs as the waitress started taking down our drinks orders, when who should walk into the restaurant but my mother. She looked more beautiful and radiant than I'd seen her look in a long time, almost as if she'd dropped 10 years off her age. She looked like a butterfly that had emerged from a cocoon. She seemed younger, more vibrant, incredibly radiant. She ran towards me and my sister, giving us both warm, loving hugs. The next thing I knew, my father was cradling her in his arms. They were kissing each other passionately. I didn't know where to look. It was so embarrassing. My parents were behaving like two lovesick teenagers, with eyes only for each other. "What's going on?" I asked, looking from my mother to my father in bewilderment. I was to learn from my mother that while we'd been staying with my dad at his trailer, she'd put our Victorian home on the market. A psychic had been called around to the property. She could sense the presence of a hostile Victorian governess who used to live at the house back in the day, taking care of a couple of young children who lived there. The ghost communicated with the psychic. She admitted to turning my parents against each other deliberately. She claimed she despised all men. She was determined to get my father out of our house, using drastic measures by turning up the heat between them. She admitted to filling my mother's head with hateful thoughts towards him. I must admit I was sceptical that my parents' relationship could be restored to its former glory. Surely there was too much water under the bridge, I thought, too much damage already done, too many cruel cutting words that had been spoken. It would seem I was wrong, because when our family moved into a brand new home, our lives were transformed, and barely ever did I hear them argue again. They are still very much in love today, and happily married. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.